He is not the QB. He is Naruto Uzumaki, and he is one of my best students. He may not be the strongest or the most intelligent, but he has gone through more than either of us have had to bear, but that is what will make him an excellent Hokage. Despite the fact that his mind was still being rocked by Mizuki's revelation to him about the QB, and that he had been duped into stealing the scroll of seals by a traitor, Naruto couldn't help but smile at Irika's shouted exclamation. You fool Irika, that thing killed your parents, and you let its facade fool you. Well, I was going to kill you later, but your feebleness has pissed me off. Mizuki was more angry than Naruto had ever seen him, raising a shuriken in his hand as he finished his proclamation, obviously intending to go through with his implied threat. Most people would think very carefully about attacking an armed and trained ninja, but all Naruto cared about at that moment was that someone was in danger, especially someone who had just become one of his only precious people. Leaping out of the tree where he had been watching the encounter, Naruto didn't really hold back the slightly vicious grin that crossed his face, right foot slamming into Mizuki's face even as the Chunin tried to dodge. Using the man's face as a springboard, Naruto used the momentary contact to push himself off and towards Irika, landing even as Mizuki hit the ground with a heavy thud. The traitor Chunin flipped to his feet a moment later, spitting some blood from his mouth before growling at Naruto. You shouldn't have done that, demon. You just made killing you that much easier. Mizuki grabbed a kunai and charged forwards, but Naruto wasn't scared, merely forming his hands into what was quickly becoming a very familiar if unorthodox hand seal. You can try, Mizuki team. Kagebushin no Jutsu. Smoke burst around him, which Naruto expected given all the practice he had done, jumping back amongst the dozens of versions of himself that now filled the clearing. Naruto! Irika's pride was audible as the wounded Chunin tried to sit up a little straighter, though Naruto was too busy absorbing the look of shock on Mizuki's face as he stumbled to a stop. Impossible. A dozen times nothing still means nothing against a Chunin like me. A dozen? It was only then that Naruto realized that most of the other clones that had been generated in the wooded parts of the clearing edge had hidden themselves just after spawning, so Mizuki probably hadn't seen them. Well, Mizuki, perhaps you try recounting. Though after I put my fist in your face a few times, I suppose that will be least of your worries. Not the best of comebacks, Naruto thought to himself. Even as he said it, he was trying not to wince, but the clones took his cue and appeared from hiding even as he started forwards. Mizuki, to his credit, not that Naruto really wanted to give him any, managed to dispel the first three clones that rushed towards him with his kunai. Then, as two of the clones grabbed his kunai arm and impeded his attacks, the silver-haired Chunin used his other hand to backhand another clone as it tried to punch him in the face. Though as Naruto slowed to a stop, watching his clones pile onto the man and not really seeing any point in joining in, he couldn't help but feel ever so slightly cheated. He wanted to be the one to break Mizuki team's nose. Damn it. Line break. Numb. That was the only word to describe his state as Naruto walked away from the Hokage Tower, reeling from the emotional roller coaster the third Hokage had just inflicted upon him. Naruto wasn't sure that being the Kyuubi's container was better than being the beast itself. After all, given the reaction he got from the majority of Konoha, they certainly didn't make the distinction. Mizuki's betrayal, and the rather touching if awkward promotion by Irika caused enough turmoil inside his brain for one night. This meant that he did not even notice the tower's night staff, some of whom threw hate-filled glances at him, as he passed them without a word. If he had, Naruto would have noticed that it was mostly the civilian members of the night staff who were showing him such disdain. Those members of the shift that were ninja or ex-ninja were for the most part far less hateful in his regard. His evening had been, well, enlightening was one word for it, world-rocking was probably a better description. Having failed his graduation test for the third time in a row, thanks to the stupid Bushin and paper tests, Naruto had been sulking off to the side of the academy entrance, watching yearningly as the parents of the rest of his class had come to collect their children, congratulating those who had passed and consoling those that hadn't. It was then that Naruto was approached by one of his class's teachers, Mizuki, who had told him that there was an alternative test that Naruto could try and complete. Now he had tried 3 times to pass the normal test and not succeeded. Mizuki had said that this test had been created to test the more practical parts of a ninja's aptitude, in the cases where the ninja applicants were not as good with the knowledge-based side of the academy teachings. Naruto had naturally been ecstatic and had agreed to take the test instantly, rushing home to prepare himself once Mizuki explained what the test consisted of. He had been surprised that it was still the usual ANBU patrols that were taking part in the exercises, but he had spent more than enough time around the area that their sensors would not detect his chakra as unusual. And slipping past them physically? He was Naruto Uzumaki Databeo. Not that he was trying to brag, but he was the sneaking expert extraordinaire of Konoha, and the poor ANBU had not stood a chance at finding him. Only Irika had ever managed to catch him when he was pranking people, though he did suspect that not all of them were taking it as seriously as they had made out they were at the time. With the sneaking in part completed, Naruto had done as he had been asked by Mizuki and completed his alternative testing by breaking into the Hokage Tower and stealing a prepared scroll of Jutsus. The only minor hiccup in this plan had been the fact that the Hokage had been in his office working when Naruto had arrived, having snuck past the ANBU guards as he had done so many times before and not considering the old man would be present for such a test. Faced with adversity, he didn't falter, Naruto using his original technique, Sexy no Jutsu, which had distracted the old man enough for Naruto to get what he needed. Grabbing the scroll Naruto had left hurriedly, he would then have to learn one of the techniques written on the parchment before meeting Mizuki at the meeting point in the woods by Training Ground 15 before midnight. Otherwise, he was told he would have failed the test. This would have been fine. He had managed the infiltration in less than 2 hours, leaving him 5 in which he had learned the technique Kagebushin, or Shadow Clone Jutsu, and then it was simply waiting for Mizuki to arrive, whereupon he would have shown off his jutsu and got his headband, which would have been brilliant if only the team hadn't lied to him. After the fight, which was more a game of cat and mice before ending in a rather one-sided pile-on, Irika had then given Naruto his own headband. As Naruto had been stunned into silence at the move, the scarred Chunin took the opportunity to tell him that he had gained the rank of Genin through a field mission test, rather than the academy testing. And the Chunin instructor was quick to continue. Naruto was not and never would be the demon that Mizuki had claimed he was. He was its jailer. It was him alone that was stopping the beast escaping and going on another rampage. This reassurance was nice, but that didn't stop the dots slowly connecting in his head as he walked down one of the darker alleys towards his flat building. Being chucked out of the orphanage for being an unwelcome burden, none of the other kids wanting to play with him, saying their parents had told them he was a bad kid and that they should avoid him if they knew what was good for them. The looks and treatment given by the academy teachers during his years there, the failure of 2 exams he knew he should have at least scraped passes on due to his ability on the obstacle course, the taijutsu exams, and the stealth testing. As this self-revelation of why his life had always been such a struggle was sinking in, Naruto caught the sounds of movement from above him. Drawing on his years of pranking experience, Naruto leaped lightly and stealthily up onto the rooftops to see who it was, anything at this point to provide him with something else to think about other than tonight's truths. Looking up along the curve of the roof, Naruto saw 2 vaguely familiar Chunin settling at the plateaued roof point at the top, and Naruto jumped into a recess to avoid being seen by them. The last thing he needed tonight was to be stopped under suspicion of spying on some ninja, especially given they had probably been involved in the hunt for him after he ran off with the forbidden scroll. His curiosity now sated with the quick investigation as he didn't recognize them as anyone he knew. Naruto sighed at his failed attempt to distract himself and prepared to slip past them to continue on his way home. However, as he moved through the shadows to get past them, he caught their conversation and stopped to listen. After all, it was not like he had anything to get home to tonight other than his own conflicted thoughts and darkened room. And besides, even if they did notice him, which he considered very unlikely at this stage, they probably wouldn't be able to catch him. Not without using any of the more dangerous techniques the 2 of them might have in their collective arsenal at any rate. It was the taller of the 2 who was speaking at that point, looking down at a scroll sadly. I was certain that would work. She's a girl, and she must have liked the roses, right? The shorter one reached over and patted his friend's shoulder twice. His tone obviously meant to be comforting, even if it did come across as slightly exasperated. I really cannot understand why you keep trying so hard, Izumo. After all, you've been chasing her for years now. All she has done is ignore all you and put you down regardless of what you have come up with or tried. The now named Izumo shook his head disbelievingly at what the other Chunin was saying, throwing his hands up in the air as Naruto settled into the darkest area of the roof. Of course you wouldn't understand, Kotetsu. You were in an arranged marriage by the time you were 7. One who never had to chase their dream girl wouldn't understand how much she is worth this effort and much more. Naruto was now fully listening to the talking duo. He couldn't help but compare Izumo's problem with his own problem with Sakura, the pretty and intelligent girl in his year in the academy. She was the girl he had chased after from almost day one, but she had rebuked him, sometimes quite violently as well when he had got too exuberant about it. Kotetsu snorted at his friend's daydreaming speech, obviously having heard similar ravings enough times that it was treated with pitying amusement, rather than actual derision. Sure she is, whatever you say, Izumo. What I don't understand is why you don't try and go out with someone else. What about that Orihime I have seen you hang out with every now and again? She seems nice and it would get rid of your fascination with Riku. Perhaps get her to appreciate your presence a bit more. Kotetsu trailed off as Izumo looked up, his grin visible from where Naruto was hiding. That's brilliant, Kotetsu. If I go out with someone else and treat her really well, then Riku will get real jealous that I am treating some girl other than her. She will then want to go out with me to get my attention back. Izumo stood doing a thumb-up gesture and a wide grin. He wasn't to know that whilst gesturing to Kotetsu, he was also doing it to Naruto's hidden position. The boy in question stopped breathing for a moment as he thought about it, his mind processing the seeming moment of brilliance he had luckily been given by the young Chunin. Beaming to himself, Naruto rushed off to think some more and plan it all, moving as quietly as he could so as not to disturb the two Chunin. If Naruto had stayed a minute longer, he would have seen Izumo slump, his grin disappearing as he sighed despondently, all traces of excitement gone. Who am I kidding? Doing that to any girl, that would be heartbreakingly cruel. I'm not that much of a jerk. And I bet it still wouldn't do me any good with Riku. Kotetsu patted him on the shoulder and the two fell into a companionable silence. Both of them were never to know of the massive consequences their seemingly simple conversation would have on the entire elemental nations, and the future of the 5 great ninja villages who called the continent their home. No, no, no. For hours later, and another crumpled-up piece of paper flew across the room from Naruto's battered, old and until now unused desk, the young graduate ninja barely resisting the urge to cry out in frustration. The idea had seemed a brilliant one, Naruto had thought, as he had hastened away from the two Chunin. But now that he had sat himself down to think about it, something that he was not particularly used to, none of the girls Naruto knew as more than passing acquaintances were suitable for the strategy. After all, most of them knew his prankster and troublemaking past too well and would reject any advances, just like Sakura did on an almost daily basis. Even then, assuming that the girl in question was somehow prepared to look past that and put up with him, that was merely the first hurdle for him. Then the girl in question would almost certainly be very suspicious about why he had suddenly stopped being interested in Sakura and had changed to liking them in such a short amount of time. Maybe I acted a little too carefree? Not like I could do a lot about my lack of manners when I started. His stomach grumbled for the 3rd time during this planning session, a sign he should do something to stop any further complaints. Without thinking about it too much with his now sleep-deprived brain, Naruto moved his hands into the now familiar cross sign, summoning a Kagebushin to fetch him some instant ramen. At least with Kagebushin, I have someone who will be able to clean up all this mess. As the clone slouched off to complete said task, no more awake than its creator, the original was sat staring dazedly at his hands. It took a few moments for that something clicking to life inside his head to fully register. The next minute, Naruto was scribbling away on his latest piece of parchment, grinning wildly with all signs of tiredness swept from his features. Of course, if he couldn't find a correct girl, then perhaps he could create one that would achieve the same purpose? Even as he wrote down the beginnings of his plot, his slowly reawakening mind processed the idea more and more. Naruto belated realized something. He was setting himself probably the hardest task that he had ever faced in his young life, for what that he knew many people merely saw as a childhood crush. But he would manage any problem facing him. He was a ninja now databeo. So many people had told him he would never succeed at that as well, and here he was. Nothing was beyond him if he put his mind to it now. And besides, the look on Sasuke Team's face would make all of this worth it by itself. The newly dubbed Project Shadow soon stretched an entire side of A4, far more than he had written on one topic in quite some time. Whilst he had been doing this, the Bushin had returned with his ramen and seeing him busy, had placed his in the kitchen before dispelling. Naruto's mouth suddenly began watering. Beef. He thought and went back to work before freezing for the second time this evening as he wondered how he had known that. The clone hadn't told him or given him indication, and he hadn't asked or thought of a flavor that he had particularly wanted whilst creating it, and he was far too far away for him to have smelt it that quickly. Thinking very hard, he was suddenly assaulted by a memory of him looking down at what looked like him, sat at his desk. He remembered the other him moving to pick his pen to write once more before freezing. His vision turned away to complete his orders and he walked into the kitchen. Picking up beef ramen and cooking it in the microwave for 3 minutes, the memory poked his head through the door and saw his original self working away hard on something. Given the original was busy, the clone decided to leave it in the kitchen for him to come get when he wanted it before his vision suddenly ended, and he was back as himself. His grin became even wider, if that was possible, at the thought of how useful this would be, in both Project Shadow and other plans he might come up with as he progressed as a ninja. His thoughts were stopped by another wave of tiredness and hunger, and looking up at the clock, realized it was 4 a.m. Rushing through to the kitchen to go get his ramen, Naruto decided to leave the plan for the night and return to it tomorrow with some sleep behind him. Eating his ramen with his usual vigor and being finished in less than a minute, he was ready to set up for the night. After preparing his traps, designed to alert him and deter anyone from entering the apartment, he had learned the hard way that a simple lock on the doors on the windows and doors was not enough to stop the more determined of his haters. He got ready for and then jumped into bed and fell asleep quickly, a smile on his face as he did so, for the first time in years, for tomorrow was certainly going to be an interesting day. Time skip. Next day. The next day rolled by quickly enough, and Naruto was soon at work on Project Shadow once more. He had a week before he was required back at the academy for graduation and team assignments, so it wasn't like he had anything else to do. With the idea that he could see what his shadow clones had done, and possibly were doing at any given time, he set to work with abandon. Now he had the basis of the plan. Naruto came across his first major problem. He needed the girl to invent, and as such he needed more data about girls in general. Every time he ran into a roadblock in planning the girl, he didn't get frustrated or angry as he had initially with the project the night before. Instead, Naruto simply wrote the problem down as a question that needed to be answered. And then he moved on to the next point. This level of dedication would have made Irika faint in shock from the usually inattentive and troublesome student, if the man had been there. By 1 p.m., Naruto had several sheets of questions to think about over lunch and surprisingly few actual facts to go off. The questions ranged from simple questions, such as the girl's name and where did she come from, to why had she come to Konoha, where were her family and why weren't they with her, how was she going to earn a living. With all of these in mind, he created almost a 100 Kagebushin, ready to research all of these topics and help create this character in the plot he had woven together. You 10 go disguise yourselves in the usual fashion. Then head to the market, see what information you can get. You lot. He pointed to about 20 of them, and they separated themselves into a group. Nodding in approval, Naruto continued with his plan and spoke up to the others. Go to the artisan's district in disguise, find out what job could she do. And by that I mean, what can we learn to do in the next few days? What is realistic? Remember, we are making a civilian here, not a ninja, so nothing too over the top. He paused before looking at the remainder of his new troops and gave his orders. 30 of you split up into groups of 3. At the gates, both the main ones and the smaller pedestrian-based ones. I need to know schedules, procedures, lapses and guards, and who would be the easiest to dupe. The rest of you shadow some of the girls we know. We need to know how to act like a girl for a clone to be a girl. Though no more than one of you to a girl. If you run out, find some other civilian girls to follow. This got a wince from some of the clones, but they nodded, one claiming the right to shadow I am straight away, obviously thinking of the ramen he would get whilst doing so. They were about to leave when Naruto shook his head, considering something that would help, or at least make it less suspicious. In fact, 10 of you guys plan a prank, make it the biggest, most audacious one yet. In chaos there is opportunity, as I once heard someone say. If we distract people and become the center of attention, it will be so much easier on her side as well for her to get into Konoha, and that will be the biggest challenge we face first. The clones nodded, one laughing mildly evilly at the mention of pranking, gaining a few odd looks from the others before they shrugged it off. After a moment longer of waiting to see if he had anything else to say, they spilt into their different assigned groups, though one of them turned to Naruto. Boss, if we are doing all of this, what are you going to be doing? Naruto nodded and grinned. It was a fair question after all. Good to see that the clone was making sure he wasn't going to get lazy due to his discovery. I'm going to be training. We are ninja now, boys. We have to take this seriously. Pranks and stealth aren't going to be enough anymore. He then raised his arm imperiously and pumped it in what he thought was a manly action. Now you all know your tasks, remember? If we pull this off right, Sakura-chan is ours for sure. Believe it. Feeling that was inspiring enough as the clones cheered, he paused for a moment, allowing his minions to disperse through windows and doors, transforming into other people, animals, and objects to begin their tasks. Once they were all gone, he too headed out, his destination set on the area he knew was almost always abandoned in favor of the more exciting and better-kept ones nearby, Training Ground 5, right on the edge of the village training grounds, nice and quiet. Time skip. So who wants to explain to me how an academy student, actually not just that but one of the year's worst students, managed to sneak past some of our most skilled operatives and into what is meant to be the most secure building in the Land of Fire? The cat-masked ANBU captain couldn't help but be thankful that her teams had been on exterior patrols yesterday. It meant they had only arrived in time to support with the search and cleanup operations, so she was not even in the periphery of the tiger-masked ANBU commander's anger. Instead, the cold fury and killing intent being projected by the remarkably short man was focused elsewhere, the stock still forms of monkey and wolf showing their nervousness despite their professionalism. Tiger stalked back to the middle of the room, the 15 ANBU captains watching his every move, with the resigned patience of men and women who knew that they had fucked up and were about to face the consequences. No one is willing to own up then? Fine. Since the Hokage has already torn me a new one for our lax standards, I will pass his displeasure onto you now. Wolf and Monkey, your squads are now assigned to double training duties for the next 6 months, and all non-essential leave will be cancelled effective immediately. Cat squads will cover the remainder of you Rota guarding the tower. Obviously, our men now view the Hokage Tower as a relaxation posting rather than the honor and responsibility that it should be, as that is the only reason Naruto would have been able to get into the tower and out again, with only the Hokage noticing his presence. Cat winced ever so slightly in pity for her fellow captains. Double training meant being the punching bags of the entire ANBU division, and given the trouble that was coming, people wouldn't be going lightly on them. But Tiger wasn't done yet. And let's not forget that this whole debacle was instigated by Mizuki, a rat in our midst that we didn't even consider as a risk to our security. Dragon, your teams have been in charge of working counterintelligence with the T&I department for the last 18 months, and nothing has been brought to my attention regarding Mizuki or in fact any moles that have infiltrated our village. Have you in fact made any progress in improving the safety of our village? Complacency, the bane of all superpowers, Cat could tell that Tiger had reached the same conclusion as she had regarding the true root cause of all of this. Obviously, I have let your teams run without direct intervention for too long, and many of you have become too comfortable with the status quo that has been in effect since the QB incident. Well, that ends now. The spike of intent made even Cat's hairs stand a little on end as Tiger slammed his fist into his desk. You have 1 month, either sort out your squads and have them back to doing their damn jobs or prepare your resignation letters, during which time I will come up with a set of exercises to assess your team's abilities, performance, and fitness. These will be sprung upon you without warning, and depending on the result, well, I suppose I should probably get ready for some new masks around here. Dismissed. The ill-tempered bark merely reinforced the urge that was resting in Cat's stomach, to get out of there as fast as possible, pulling off a hasty salute before shoe-shining out of the room. Arriving in her company's squad room, Cat was pleased to see her 4 squad leaders waiting for her, something she hadn't ordered them to do before heading off to the meeting. Her dragon-masked squad leader, who she referred to as Drake just to avoid any confusion as to who she was talking about, spoke up with his usual slightly aloof tone. Tiger-san was unhappy with the other's performance, then, Cat Taishu? Cat nodded even as she reached up to remove her mask, the squad room being one of the only places in Konoha that she would feel comfortable removing it of her own volition, and it added a personal touch when she spoke to her ANBU that seemed to help inspire them. Unhappy doesn't even begin to cover it, Drake. He has assigned them double training for the next 6 months and no leave, meaning that we are off the hook in that respect. However, as much as I am pleased we have avoided that chore, there is a lot of work that we need to do in the aftermath of Naruto-kun's work. The GOAT ANBU looked puzzled for a moment before seeming to remember something. Oh yes, you know the Uzumaki boy from when we used to guard him. Do you think he will end up causing us any more trouble in the near future, Yugao Taishu? Yugao Yuzuki, who had insisted on using her own name when she took her mask off even when talking business, gave a short smile and shook her head. No. Now that he has actually graduated, I imagine Naruto will be too busy celebrating and hollering it from the rooftops to cause us any actual trouble for the foreseeable future, though I pity the one who ends up with him as a Jounin sensei. For some reason, a cool breeze came from nowhere, sending shivers up her spine, but Yugao just dismissed it as a freak breeze and moved on to informing them about the tests that Tiger Taishu was preparing for the division in the coming months. Naruto would have had enough excitement yesterday to stop him doing anything else foolhardy, right? After 3 days, the plan was going rather well, Naruto thought to himself, apart from 1 or 2 minor issues. At the end of the first day, he had cancelled his clones in one go. Once they had all returned to his flat from their day's work, which given he had created over 50 of them was quite a few memories to deal with. That had led to him collapsing into a pained stupor for almost 2 hours as his brain almost shut down due to the sudden influx of what was essentially stuff. Since then, Naruto had learned to disperse only a few clones at a time if he wanted their memories. An added bonus of this was to save his poor head from further migraines, due to the reduction in the amount of time he had to spend sifting through the memories, to try and ensure that he remembered the useful information as opposed to the background stuff. They also learned that there was a method to stop him receiving clones' memories, but that seemed to involve a rather violent dispersal to ensure it happened. And it didn't always work, so he stayed away from that line of thought for now. That purple-haired woman's kunai was sharp. His pain noggin aside, he had learnt an awful lot of interesting data in the last few days. The market had been a hubbub of information for those that knew what they wanted to know, like the hike in the cost of different types of rices and other foodstuffs, due to the recent wave of bandits and missing ninja in rice country. Then there was the lack of caravans coming from wave country to the south, except for those by Gato corporations, whose members had refused to comment on the situation in the country at all when questioned about it, threatening to take their products elsewhere when pressured too much for gossip or information. The most talked about topic of the last few days was the economic decline of Suna in Wind Country, which Naruto knew from Irika's lessons contained the Sand Village, one of the top 5 biggest ninja villages of which Konoha was also a member. The Artisans District had been interesting as well. Just by posing as small animals he had managed to observe the crafters at work, allowing him to get a basic understanding of how to forge metals and craft wood. Despite this knowledge, Naruto knew that such a basic understanding would need a lot of work before he was able to do anything beyond the most simple of tasks, if he ever had the materials or the need to. There had also been some tailors that he had seen at work, but they had worked far too delicately for him to get a good understanding of the processes. He would have to work on that another time. This was where his clones had some overlap. After 2 years of failing class and therefore knowing 3 different graduating classes, there had been a surprising number of girls around his age that he actually knew. Most of those girls that hadn't passed the shinobi tests had gone into their family careers, meaning that he had essentially observed them from 2 different angles all 3 days. He was mildly surprised how much each clone missed about what was going on, though he supposed it was to do with the fact he had sent them out to look at 2 very different things about the people they were shadowing, so it was natural they would focus on some bits and not others. One girl that had interested him the most was a girl that he remembered from last year, who had gone on to become a full genin, but still worked at a blacksmith's in her spare time. Noting the girl's name down, Tenten he thought it was, he determined to try and get back in touch with her at some point soon. She was obviously talented and passionate about blacksmithing, if she had managed to acquire and keep such a job whilst being an on-duty ninja. And the way she swings that hammer, as Gigi said once, it's like poetry in motion. In addition, from what his clones had noticed during her daily routine, she didn't have many close friends outside of her genin team, probably due to her lack of socializing time and her rather serious training regimes. Probably scared or intimidated by her idiots. You'd think that her being a skilled blacksmith would mean people would realize she could help them with repairs and stuff at least. This minor hiccup didn't deter Naruto in the slightest. Anyone who was prepared to work that hard on multiple jobs was a good friend in his book. It certainly classed as unique amongst all the girls he had observed, most of whom worked the minimum required time for their shift and then went to spend all their hard-earned money on clothes or makeup. Filing all of those thoughts away with a shake of his head, he turned back to the plan and finished his decisions regarding his masterpiece, as he and his clones had jokingly started calling it. He had immediately disregarded the girl being more than a year and a half younger than him, He knew that anybody of around that age would be requested to join the academy, even more so if they were an orphan, as his girl would have to be. Naruto had decided in the end that her being half a year younger than him, born on the 16th of April, would be for the best, as it would then be reasonable for her to look up to him without seeming to be doting. He had from that information then created her look and features, everything from shape and size of nose, to length and color of her hair. The finished product was a girl who was slightly taller than average, with hazel eyes and shoulder-length black hair, common enough in the elemental nations, and what had become clear as a rice country build and a fire country face, which she would claim was her mother's heritage, as their village was near the border between the two countries in Naruto's fictional past for the girl. On rice country, he had had the clones fetch some books on the place, so that if questioned the girl would know enough information about her home of origin. The current stuff was easy enough. He had a clone follow a caravan out of Konoha to get an idea on the lay of the land. He had heard back that morning, when bandits had attacked the caravan with military precision, before being beaten off by Konoha patrols, who didn't pursue the bandits when they had fled beyond the border into rice country. This failure just went to show that the ninja had their limitations in how much they could protect the caravans, and that even in fire country you weren't completely safe from attack, regardless of the propaganda around the village about fire country being the safest place in the whole of the elemental nations. Next was family background, and what had happened to them to cause the girl to appear by herself at the entrance to Konoha, which he created a new sheet for the purpose and began to work on solving this new problem. In his concentration, Naruto failed to notice that in the corner of his now rather cluttered apartment, hidden under a rather complex genjutsu technique that focused on all of the senses rather than just one, was a masked ninja in ANBU clothing and armor. Persona change. Na agent. The masked face took everything in without reaction or emotion. The plans, the gossip, and the intentions of the young ninja in training head towards the village. After all, he mused as he scratched the mark on his mask idly. Danzo-sama had asked to know everything that the BU container was up to. This was especially true when the had come up with a scheme such as the one he was working on now, bordering on brilliance in several ways and complete foolishness in others. It was 1 a.m. when the ninja felt it safe enough to shoo Shin out of the boy's apartment, onto one of the nearby roofs, to meet his replacement for the next 12-hour shift. After a wordless update that was transmitted using hand signals, he had jumped off down into the streets of Konoha, slipping off quietly to one of the secret entrances that the root ninja used to get to their HQ, so that he could report and then grab some shut-eye. The entrance was in one of the quieter training grounds, and after pressing several seemingly random points in the ground in order, a small opening appeared, allowing him to drop almost 5 meters to the tunnel floor below. He hurried through the maze of passageways, doubling back on himself twice, so as to ensure he wasn't followed, as was procedure for any agents who were at place in the city. After several more minutes quick walking, he arrived at a much better maintained and lit set of tunnels, which led to the various training areas and bunks required by the group. Following the same old path, he soon found himself outside the heavy oaken doors of Danzo's office, which he knocked quietly on twice. Waiting for a moment, he heard the coded command to enter, thanks to his sharpened hearing, and entered quickly, not wishing to waste his boss's time. The room was remarkably Spartan, with nothing but a map of Konoha on the wall behind the chair and desk of probably the most informed man in Konoha, including that idiot Jiraiya. The man in question was sat in his desk, looking over papers involving various mission details and financing details. The man certainly did not strike you as imposing or even commanding. At 5 feet 6 inches he was one of the shortest male ANBU in history, and that isn't including the obvious detriments of his crippled arm and eye or his age, a tender 72 that year. As the war hawk looked up with a calculating look, however, the air of ease and authority that seemed to wash over the Na as he was examined in a mere moment, it was clear the man's strength were his weaknesses. People, civilian and ninja alike, often did underestimate him for his injuries, and he would use that at the most vital moment against them, whether in combat or during meetings and negotiations. Your report on the boy and his recent actions, Agent. Your last report was not very clear on what the boy was planning. No pleasantries, all business, which was how Danzo preferred to operate whilst on duty. With easy precision, the scroll was exchanged silently and Danzo began reading whilst the agent stood there, awaiting the verdict. What he did not expect was the raspy chuckle that erupted from the old man's lips as he continued reading, which persisted for quite some time throughout the analysis. Finally Danzo sat back, his face a rare sight of him grinning with amusement. Amazing. what one boy's determination and inability to admit defeat can do. He had no help with this from anyone. The agent shook his head. As far as we can gather, it is all Naruto's own work, other than his shadow clones, that is. Danzo nodded. Excellent. This, if anything, is exactly what I need to prove to Sarutobi that we have got too lax and peace-like in recent times. If one boy, barely a genin, can infiltrate our defenses with a mole and then leave her there, then I'm sorry, we should give up and ask to be invaded now. The agent said nothing. He knew that if his input was required, he would be asked for it. So, the question is now, what do we do with this information? Any ideas, agent? As the agent opened his mouth to speak, he was cut off by the voice that was clearly female. Let him run with it, Danzo-sama. He isn't doing anything against the law at this point. Even after the infiltration, all he has essentially done is infiltrate himself into his own village, which cannot be a punishable offense surely. Danzo nodded, then looked at the agent, who was trying to subtly work out who that voice belonged to. He couldn't see her in the shadows without turning his head, and the voice reminded him of someone from somewhere, though placing it right now was beyond him. The agent decided to give his own input. Now it had been asked for, which was the only formality Danzo usually insisted upon. I think we give him a bit of a hand, Danzo-sama. After all, if this is to prove a point, we want it to work to its greatest extent. I must also admit the idea that spawned this, if the kid pulls it off. The agent shook his head in disbelief for a moment before continuing with his last observation. There's a reason he's the luckiest person in the elemental nations. There's no way this would work for anyone else. Danzo nodded in agreement. If any other ninja had presented him with this idea as a way to test Konoha's defenses against infiltration, he would have easily come up with a dozen different ways for it to fail. These would have ranged from the fact that the shadow construct was too flimsy to survive the Konoha village environment to the reasoning that the Chunin guards would be able to detect the large amount of chakra present in the Bushin. But Naruto, in an odd case for the orphan container, seemed to have thought of ways around this, planning on creating the girl clone with the 100 other clones at the same time. That would dramatically reduce the output of the clone, to the point where the guards would not be suspicious of its chakra. And the fact that he was having the infiltrator become a civilian meant that it would not be subject the roughest parts of Konoha's life. Shadow clones were fairly weak, it was true, but they could stand the hassle of a market street as long as no one hit it too hard. Humming, he made a decision in regards to the boy. Keep tabs on him, I want to know exactly what he does and why he does it. But we will not give him any help yet. Only if it looks like he will fail will we step in and change things up. Otherwise, we do what we always have done, and that is sit in the shadows and wait for the boy to do what he does, and that is surprise everyone. With a nod of assent from both of the present characters, he then waved his hand dismissively. Well, get out of here, I expect the next report in 4 days from your replacement as you are on leave, as that is when he is planning on doing his infiltration. With another nod, both nodded and vanished in Shushin Jutsu away from the area. Sighing, Danzo looked down at the paperwork he still had to complete before he could go home. It was going to be a long night. Umei Kaitoma ran towards Konoha, away from the burning caravan that had been kind enough to give her transport and shelter as they moved into the land of fire. Outside of character, the shadow clone of Naruto Uzumaki, reinforced with chakra to improve his rigidity and lifelikeness, cursed his bad luck and of those he had been traveling with. He had snuck out of Konoha through the gates at about midday, under the guise of a merchant, getting almost a mile from the wall before breaking his henge and creating the shadow clone. The clone took a good portion of his chakra to make, and was the product of almost 3 days' worth of experimentation with the shadow clone technique. It was hardier, stronger, and faster than his other clones, nothing compared to himself of course, but nothing to be laughed at. The clone had then moved off to the main road on the Rice country border whilst the original returned to Konoha, this time under a different guise. Reaching his destination, he had transformed into the characterized Umei, ensuring that his clothes looked muddy and well used. Another result of the experimentation was that each of Umei's clothes could be removed and not be considered part of the original clone, something that had been an obvious flaw quite early on in the development process. She had taken less than an hour to encounter a caravan, headed towards the center of Hai no Kuni, that would pass by Konoha on the way to their final destination. She had been instantly mothered by the head of the caravan's wife, after explaining tearfully that her family's farm had been burned by bandits, and that her father had told her to run as fast as she could and to get out of Rice Country. Umei claimed she had heard that Konoha was a safe place to live, and she really wanted to try and do something other than farming with her life. And as it would only take 2 days to reach Konoha, there was only the charge of 100 ryo to be paid, which the clone managed with the money the original had given him. With their emotions primed due to the story, and their pockets lined with her money, the caravan people saw no reason not to let her accompany them. Things had then gone to shit. When only 10 miles from Konoha's familiar wooden walls, bandits had leapt from the trees, the bandits' numbers enough to quickly overwhelm the few guards the caravan had hired to defend them. The caravan leader had told her to run for Konoha and get help, and that was what she did. Umei did her best to ignore the sounds of screaming and jeering from behind her, as some of the bandits gave chase to her. The bandits had stopped chasing about 20 minutes beforehand, probably to return to the looting and pillaging. She hated feeling weak, but the best she could do in her current capacity was go for help as fast as she could, and hope that they would be able to rescue any survivors before they were taken away somewhere horrible. The gates of Konoha came into view very quickly, and as she approached she saw 2 chunin who were sat in the booth by the large gates, playing some type of game. "Help! Please help! Bandits are attacking my caravan!" she yelled out to them desperately. In an instant the chunin were on their feet, one talking into his earpiece, and the other sprinting towards her. Strength gone, she felt her legs give out and she began to tumble to the floor, only for the chunin to catch her and help her back to her feet. The gates opened slightly and a squad of black-clothed ninja poured out at great speed, shooting off down the road that Umei had come from, a blur to her vision. "MS, don't worry, you're okay now." Umei nodded, but knew she had to get the message out, otherwise it was all for naught. Forcing herself up, she managed to speak unsteadily to the one who had caught her. "Please, bandits attacked the caravan." The man nodded in understanding before tapping his ear in a complicated pattern. "Do not worry, miss. My men are on their way to help your caravan." He then brought out a small container of water that he raised to her mouth, pouring a little inside, which she swallowed quickly in order to soothe her parched throat. After drinking most of what would have been inside the container, she struggled to her feet with the man's help, who helped her to the side of the road where there was a guard booth set up. Setting her down in chair, he channeled chakra into the pot on the surface top, which used seals to convert the chakra into heat energy for boiling water to serve tea. Electric versions were available, but it was cheaper to have someone heat their water with chakra on guard duty, one of the many money-saving schemes that had been implemented by the council since the yondaime had died. After pouring a cup of hot tea, which she nursed carefully, having observed his simple heating of the water with his chakra in obvious awe. This was more due to the fact that the original did not know that such devices existed, as opposed to Umei trying to act, they would have been so useful. Once she had taken the 3rd sip of tea, the chunin obviously decided that the time was right to ask some questions, before she fell asleep or got too comfortable that she lapsed into shock from what had happened today. "I am afraid I must ask you a couple of questions now, Ms." she replied quietly. Umei Kaitoma Shinobi-sama. "I just wanted to come to Konoha to live quietly, I swear. After Mama and Papa were killed." She cut off in what she hoped was a believable moment of sorrow, and it seemed to work as the man shifted uncomfortably before continuing. "I am sorry to hear that, Umei-san. My name is Izumo and there is no need for the sama, I assure you. Were your parents with you on the caravan here? Do they have your documents with them?" Umei shook her head sadly. This was where Naruto's backstories paid dividends to her entry plan. "We had them on our small farm on the other side of the border, just inside Rice Country, and that was all I knew. Papa wanted me to take over the farm when I grew up, even though I was a girl, or he wanted me to find a local boy to marry so they could look after it instead. But then the bandits came and Papa was screaming for me to run, and I did it all night until I reached the main road, which is where I met the caravan. It wasn't the bandits that were following me that attacked the caravan, was it?" Izumo shook his head reassuringly in an attempt to soothe her. She was acting quite frantic now, as the thought that such a thing could have happened if Umei's backstory had not been entirely fictional. "No, I highly doubt it, Umei-san. They would not risk attacking a caravan in Fire Country for the simple reason of trying to stop you escaping, and this was just an unlucky happenstance. If you do not have your documents due to their destruction, I will call a ninja here to take you to the administration buildings. where they will ask you some more questions and create you some new documents for you to use whilst you settle here. Umei couldn't help the shocked grin that spread over her face as she hurriedly placed her tea down and ran to hug him gratefully. The plan was working better than they had thought it would. "You mean I can stay?" Izumo nodded, smiling fondly at her reaction. "Of course, Konoha welcomes anyone who comes with the correct intentions, and you need somewhere to stay after your horrible past. The administration boys have the last say, but I don't think they will have any objections at all." It took 10 minutes for the ninja to arrive that would come and escort her to the offices. But they had flown by as Umei had jumped between worry for her caravan friends and joy for having got past the first stage of Project Shadow. Now as she walked with her escort through the streets of Konoha, she was counting down the seconds before Stage 2 began. The signs of it were already present, with people covered in tar, feathers, paint, or a weird mixture of the three. The Chunin with her was obviously trying to ignore the sights that she was looking at, mumbling about annoying brats under his breath. Suddenly tar fell upon him from the rooftops, followed by feathers floating down to stick atop of the liquid substance. Looking up, Umei saw Naruto grinning down with 2 empty buckets in hand. "Uzumaki!" The Chunin yelled, and was about to give chase when he remembered his charge, and seemed torn between his duty and his revenge on the blonde-haired brat. Naruto noticed this and, to sweeten the deal, decided a bit of taunting was not pushing the prank too far. "What's the matter? Are you too chicken to come after a future Hokage? I knew I was awesome, but to be scaring Chunin like you already, you must really be pathetic." That seemed to work, as the Chunin leapt at him with a roar, Naruto back flipping easily. He was then off along the rooftops, running away with a cheeky grin on his face as the Chunin charged after him, the two leaving Umei alone in the supposedly unfamiliar city. Before she had to act too worried about being alone, a voice called out from behind her, causing her to jump and spin round, the clone's nerves still on edge from encountering the bandits and having to run for her life. She calmed a moment later when she saw Naruto, the original she assumed at any rate, stood there leaning against the side of the pavement she and her escort had been walking on. "Hi there. Noticed you looked a little lost. And as I've not seen you around here, are you new to Konoha?" She nodded, a little warily. The ninja who had been leading her didn't seem to like this boy, even before he had pranked him. But at the same time the boy seemed friendly enough, and wasn't avoiding her like the plague, which the other villagers were doing. His grin increased in size and he stepped forward, bowing slightly. "I am Naruto Uzumaki, Genin-level ninja. Pleased to be your first friend in Konoha." This bit had not been planned by the clone and master before meeting. This was because they could not be entirely sure which ninja she would get as an escort, and whether the plan would be able to distract the ninja would work, to allow for Naruto to arrange the first meeting. As such, the clone had no script to work off and had to improvise. She bowed back to him. "Umei Kaitoma Naruto-san, and yes, I am new here. I was on my way to get some new documents, as mine were lost when bandits burned my parents' farm." She trailed off, her voice having gotten quieter and more downtrodden as she carried on. Naruto sensed that the clone was more than acting with her actions, and therefore reacted with genuine concern in his response. "Did something happen to you, Umei-chan? I will show you to the administration building, they can sort you out." As they walked, Umei's story came out of her quickly, the events still fresh in her mind. Naruto's face grew stormy as they reached their destination, and he seemed to anticipate the arrival of the dozen masked and black-cloaked men around him, one of which was spattered with multicolored paint that Umei did not have to guess the origin of. One of them, obviously female with long purple hair and a mask painted to look like a cat, strode forward and held out a hand to Naruto as she spoke calmly with only the smallest hints of humor at her companion's misfortune. "Naruto-kun, you know why we are here. Hokage-sama wants to see you to explain that, just because you have had a week off from the academy, does not mean you repaint Konoha in your favorite shades of the rainbow." The ANBU with the paint on his cloak, his mask looking like an ox, growled at this, and there was a chuckle from one of the remaining ANBU, though you couldn't tell which one. Naruto nodded somberly, his face set in stone as he reached out and grabbed the ANBU's hand. "Good. I knew he would want to see me, and now I have my own discussion to have with him about events outside the village." He turned to face Umei, who was playing the part of confused newcomer very well. "Well, the building in front of you is the one where you will get your documents, and I am sure I will see you around the village soon enough. If you need a hand in the future, just ask around for Uzumaki Naruto, the future Hokage." And with a shake of the cat-masked ninja's head, they all disappeared in a flurry of leaves, leaving Umei alone once more. She shyly looked around and slightly overawed by the whole flurry of events related to her arrival, and it was very meekly that she walked up and knocked on the large oak doors that signified the entrance to the civilian administration buildings, even more worried and unsure of her future now than she was when she had arrived to the village hidden in the leaves. At the same time that Umei was meeting the wonders of Konoha paperwork, Naruto was being ushered into the workroom of the greatest of all shinobi, since the Rakuto Sannin himself, of course. The Sandaime Hokage Sasuke Sarutobi, titled by his enemies as the Shinobi no Kami, or God of Shinobi, veteran of 60 years of warfare and subterfuge. This was not to mention that he had lived through 3 world wars, both the reigns of all his predecessors, and outlived his successor to the title of Hokage. He wore every one of those years in his office, his wrinkled form dwarfed by the gnarled oak desk that had been created by the first Hokage, the piles of paperwork only adding to the image. This did not mean that the man could not be commanding and intimidating when necessary, however. Even as he entered, Naruto could feel the disappointed gaze of the man he affectionately termed Gigi upon him, and squirmed like the admonished child in front of his parent. The grizzled shinobi sat back in his seat with a sigh and lit his pipe with a click of his fingers, his gaze never leaving the young shinobi in front of him. "Naruto, I think we all know what you have done wrong and why you have done it. But you are a shinobi now, and as such cannot get away with the same childish pranking that you did when you were younger." Naruto's breath had stopped at the start of that sentence, thinking that the Hokage knew the truth about Umei, though it quickly became evident that he did not and was only punishing him for the prank. He quickly bowed his head and apologized. Even with all the planning into his project, he had not remembered there would be a consequence to his pranking. Sarutobi puffed out a perfectly formed ring of smoke and spoke with mild exasperation, gesturing to the pile of paperwork on his left, more than half the work on his desk. "That pile of paperwork is the first part of the consequences of your actions today. That is at least another 3 hours' work for me before I can go home tonight, and the same goes for the civilian administrators and their secretaries. This means that you now owe me for that time, and the time of those you have inconvenienced with your prank." Naruto gulped. Contrary to general opinion, Naruto could actually do mathematics when he felt like it. He just found it too boring when there was no real purpose to finding the answers to the problems he was presented with. In this occasion, however, he quickly worked out that he had, in the process of ensuring Umei's successful integration into the village, clocked himself almost 100 hours of punishment time from the Hokage, and that was if Sarutobi kept it at the lightest sentence that seemed possible, which was to repay every hour with another hour. If the man decided that the punishment was to be more severe on Naruto and to double that time, Naruto flinched slightly as Sarutobi chuckled once more. "So you realize the magnitude of your efforts today, at least in part. At this point in time, Naruto, you owe 371 hours 54 minutes of time to the village of Konoha, as well as 4,000 ryo worth of damages." Naruto nearly fainted at that. How had the number got so high? He then remembered that he had not included the work of the shinobi guards, who had chased after him whilst he was performing the prank, or those that had to be drafted in to cover the positions left vacant by the chasers. He gulped and looked up pleadingly to the Hokage, hoping against hope for some level of reprieve. Sarutobi shook his head and wagged his finger at Naruto. "You are an adult now, Naruto. You became one the moment you accepted your headband, and as such, you have to face the consequences of your actions." Naruto's mood had hit an all-time low. There was no way he was going to be able to pay the fine, work off the time, and actually keep his flat and Umei's when she got one. With a deflated sigh, Naruto bowed his head dejectedly. "By your leave then, Hokage-sama. I need to go and pack." With Sarutobi raising his eyebrow at the statement but nodding nevertheless, Naruto turned and headed quietly to the door. Just as he reached the door, he turned and asked a surprising question, though his dejected manner obviously hit Sarutobi hard. "By the way, Hokage-sama, a caravan was attacked not far from Konoha today. I met one of the people who survived. Did we catch the attackers?" Sarutobi's I quirked further, but he responded slowly. No, we did not manage to catch them, Naruto. The bandits were gone with their loot and prisoners by the time the Chunin got there, and they have covered their tracks very well." Naruto nodded sadly, as if expecting the answer, and then opened the door and moved through it, shutting it quietly behind him, leaving the Hokage alone to his work. Persona change. Hiruzen Sarutobi. Fire shadow of the Leaf Village. Sarutobi sat back with a heavy sigh. The conversation had gone better than he had expected, and that was the worst part about it, he supposed. Naruto had been hit by the truth about the reason he was shunned and hated by the villagers, as well as a few of the shinobi who would not listen to the Hokage's explanations and reasoning, only a few short days ago in one of the most nightmarish scenarios Sarutobi could have possibly thought up. Then, in a rather audacious prank, that was obviously meant to be the boys' way of getting back at the villagers for their misguided dislike in a way that would not cause great harm or damage, Naruto had accidentally and unknowingly forced himself into a position of effective servitude to the village. Sarutobi couldn't lessen the time owed as much as he would have liked to. Naruto was a shinobi now, one of his soldiers. If he showed any more favoritism than he already had towards the container, there would be uproar from both the civilian and military sides of his village. Though given their own subtle attempts at favoring their friends and families, he did wonder if it mattered. Almost half an hour later, just when Sarutobi was at the end of his patience waiting for them to finish debating their next move, the shadow in the top corner of his office finally shifted. The cat-masked ANBU from before leapt down silently, standing in front of Sarutobi respectfully, allowing the man to puff on his pipe for a moment longer. In an attempt to reduce the sorrow he felt at dealing out the young boy's punishment. Finally, he took one last long inhalation and nodded for the woman to speak, his other hand making a gesture for the other ANBU, those who were assigned as his guards at all times, to leave for the moment to allow them some privacy. They did so, only far enough not to be able to hear anything, more than close enough to move to his protection if it was required. The moment that she sensed they were gone, the woman opened up into a respectful but still scything diatribe at him. "Hokage-sama, with all due respect, do you realize what you have done? You may have just cost us one of the most promising new genin we had in years. All because of one prank? I admit it was audacious and large, but the ingredients all seem to have been picked to be removable and not too damaging to clothing, which in itself is a level of forethought that most our ninja will never possess. In fact, the only damage that was actually done to anything was done by the shinobi pursuing the boy's clones, not the boy himself. Yet you lay all the blame solely on him? Not even Anko gets that level of punishment, and her pranks are sadistic or borderline murderous at times." She took a large breath of air, but continued well before Sarutobi could think to respond. "You could have declared it was a training exercise, and that every shinobi that had been caught by Naruto was killed by an enemy assailant. Not only would it have given the boy some respect, it would have been believable as well. For ANBU Hokage-sama, that's how many of my men, my soldiers, would have been killed today if Naruto and his clones were infiltrators rather than pranksters. And that's just the clean kills. Another dozen in other units would have been maimed or crippled at least. I'm not even going to go into the number of our regular shinobi that were caught up in it." She seemed to run out of steam, ending up just glaring at the Hokage through her mask. Sarutobi had to admit he was surprised that she had been so pressing on the subject. She was usually very controlled no matter the situation at hand. Thinking about what she said, he realized it did actually make sense, and he voiced it as such. "I would have covered it with the training exercise ruse if I had thought of it, Yugao-san, but I do not think of everything, and as such, the boy had to be punished for what he has done. Considering the number of people that were clamoring for his head after this event, claiming this proved he was a menace to the village. His time owed and the monetary fine is some of the nicest things I could have punished him with." He felt the increase in the intensity of her glare at this comment and couldn't help but think he was missing something for a moment before he was brought back to the first thing she had said to him. "What do you mean, we might lose him? I know it seemed harsh, but Naruto is not going to abandon the village. Surely? The fine should be easily absorbed by the money I have been giving him as well as the stipend. As he owns the apartment complex, it's not like he has to pay rent." He was cut off by the slamming of Yugao's hand into his desk and the spike of fury that ripped through the room with such intensity that it was almost palpable. You ignorant old man." The fact that Yugao, an ANBU captain of Konoha, was here screaming at him at the top of her lungs and killing intent pouring off her like the heat off a blazing inferno, made Sarutobi realize how much a mistake he must have made to earn this reaction from one of the most reserved kunoichi under his command. Yugao obviously even shocked herself with her outburst, and the next second the killing intent was gone and she was stood back at attention, eyes cast downwards in submission. The fire and fury were still there, however, bubbling just under the surface, even as the rest of her first squad stormed back into the room, weapons drawn and ready to fight. They were stopped with a look from Sarutobi, and a gesture had them back outside. Though no less ready to fight, he imagined, as he activated several privacy seals this time, just in case the fury of Yugao made a return. He surveyed the woman in front of him for a minute in silence, noting the uneven flowing of her chakra, which showed a state of extreme emotion in shinobi to the point that they forgot all reasoning. To have garnered such a reaction, he was almost afraid of what he was about to uncover. "Yugao, take off your mask and sit. I think you have a lot to tell me." Yugao did so carefully, still worried about her leader's reaction to her loss of control. She took off the mask, revealing a pretty face that was unmarked by combat or disfigurement, a trait that very few elite kunoichi could truly claim. As she placed the mask on the table, she looked down, and Sarutobi belatedly realized that she thought he was claiming her position in punishment for her outburst. He pushed the mask back to her with a gnarled hand, to her obvious surprise, and he leaned forward, both elbows on the desk and his hands joined underneath his jaw, as he asked the most pertinent question of all. "Yugao, why might Naruto need to pack his things due to this punishment?" And for the first time, he saw something other than solemnness or anger enter the face of Yugao in almost 10 years, when she had first joined the ANBU at the tender age of 14. Sorrow entered her eyes and her features drooped. He asked me not to tell you if you didn't ask, and you didn't until now, so I wasn't breaking orders by not telling you. Hokage-sama, everything you think you know about Naruto's life has been twisted by the boy to ensure that you didn't worry about him more than you already do. Sarutobi's eyebrow quirked once more. He was doing that a lot this afternoon for some reason, all in regards to the young container. She continued before he could ask any questions, though, her voice tinged with the same sadness that now encompassed her face. "The fine worries me because, unlike what you think, Naruto has no money to pay it off with. The villagers overcharge him for absolutely everything. He has to pay 5 times as much money for his gas and electricity as he should. His water is usually poisoned and overcharged, so he has to buy purifiers just to have a drink. As you know, they are not cheap, but if he doesn't, he will be ill for days if he is lucky. The food they sell him has gone off or is similarly poisoned, and given your own laws regarding interfering with the container, we cannot interfere unless one of them actually attacks him. Why do you think every time you see him he insists on Ichikaru's ramen? As much as he loves ramen, it's more so that you don't have to see what he normally has to eat the rest of the time." She paused for breath, and Sarutobi's heart sank at the thought that there was more to come that he didn't know about. The only thing that was going to brighten things up for him was that once he became a ninja, he would earn more money off missions, and therefore be able to live without having to get money off you or I to survive. And now that you have told him he has to do the first 3 months of his ninja career for free, whilst having to continue to pay the ridiculous prices he does, assuming he passes his Jounin Sensei's test, of course. You wonder why I think he may be a flight risk. Yugao merely raised a single eyebrow before continuing. Even if he does stay, he would have to live in the training grounds, as the only way for him to pay that 4,000 ryo in the time period would be to sell the apartment building, as much as that would pain him to do so. It's not like the banks would give a newly minted genin with this kind of mark to his name alone, even if he was just a normal kid. That's 3 months of living wild, with no social life due to lack of money. Not that he would have much of one with the village attitude towards him, and only his team to support him. Unless you have put him with Kurinai-chan and 2 of the graduates that actually get along with him resigning and leaving is a foregone conclusion. Sarutobi gulped, looking at the top piece of paper he had been looking over before tomorrow's graduation. The team selections. What he had thought was a harsh but fair punishment to curb Naruto's pranking instincts had turned out to be one of the worst things he could have done to the poor boy. Even worse, Naruto seemed to have taken the crippling blow to his life and career far too easily, with a resigned acceptance that came with true despair, something that only made Sarutobi feel even worse about what he had just done. He stood, preparing himself to go and try to find the boy and remand the punishment. Anything before the boy left the village. Because until he passed the Jounin test tomorrow, regardless of what Sarutobi had said, Naruto was still a civilian in the eyes of the law. A civilian with a kinjutsu and a bijou at his disposal, but a civilian nevertheless. So if Naruto did leave, there was nothing Sarutobi or anyone else in the village could do to bring him back, by force or otherwise. If they did so, They would risk the wrath of the Fire Lord, who was a just defendant of civilians in Hai no Kuni, whether he was defending them against his samurai or Sarutobi's ninja. He was stopped by Yugao's sob, an action he never would have predicted possible from the woman, even as she spoke her final piece. Going after him now won't help. If you do, all that will reveal is that I have broken his wish and his trust in me. That will just make it even worse, as then he will not trust any of us. And you can't repeal the punishment. You stamped it with your seal straight after you got his acceptance and gave him the official copy, so it is legal and binding even to you. Sarutobi sank back down, eyes shifting to confirm what his mind already knew, that Yugao was correct and he had stamped the paper with his seal. This meant that the moment Naruto became a full genin, the start of his punishment would begin. He would have 3 months to pay the fine and to work off the debt. And another weight settled on Sarutobi's already burdened shoulders as he finally came to terms with what he had just done. To a boy who had hidden the worst of his life from him, in an attempt to make an old shinobi's life less worrisome. Though he knew there was nothing more he could do without making the situation worse for both himself and the boy, and could only hope that the boy would still turn up to the graduation class as he was meant to at 2 p.m. the next day. Previously on the deception gone awry. If they did so, they would risk the wrath of the Fire Lord, who was a just defendant of civilians in Hai no Kuni, whether against his samurai or Sarutobi's ninja. He was stopped by Yugao's sob, an action he never would have predicted possible from the woman, even as she spoke her final piece. Going after him now won't help. If you do, all that will reveal is that I have broken his wish and his trust in me, and that will just make it even worse, as then he will not trust any of us. And you can't repeal the punishment. You stamped it with your seal straight after you got his acceptance and gave him the official copy, so it is legal and binding even to you. Sarutobi sank back down, eyes shifting to confirm what his mind already knew, that Yugao was correct and he had stamped the paper with his seal, which the moment Naruto became a full genin would signal the start of his punishment, and he would have 3 months to pay the fine and to work off the debt. And another weight settled on Sarutobi's already burdened shoulders as he finally came to terms with what he had just done to a boy who had hidden the worst of his life from him, in an attempt to make an old shinobi's life less worrisome. Though he knew there was nothing more he could do without making the situation worse for both himself and the boy, and could only hope that the boy would still turn up to the graduation class as he was meant to at 2 p.m. the next day. The last 2 hours had been exhausting. She had been accepted into the village, and the administration people had even given her 5,500 ryo to get accommodation, from a fund that was given to refugees from the Fire Lord's own coffers. Of course, she could not carry that amount of money around on her along with her few meager belongings, so it was in the form of a banker's draft in her money pouch on her waist, one that was only usable in Konoha, a method they had devised of ensuring that their enemies wouldn't try and bleed them dry by sending in refugees and then having them leave. Despite this incentive, however, none of the letting in the main village areas had had rooms available within anything approaching her possible budget, and had refused to allow any form of bargaining or pleading, something they obviously looked down upon due to their dealings with ninja and their subterfuge. As such, she found herself traipsing piteously down towards the more suburban areas that were less well-kept and shadier districts, judging by the type of person that traveled down the streets with her. Her feet ached. Her joints were stiff, and at that moment her stomach clenched once more in hunger, reminding her that she had not eaten since the night before. Spotting a small ramen stand that seemed to be open, she ran to it, heading inside and plunking herself down on a chair. The waitress walked to her with a welcoming smile on her face that instantly made her feel at home. "Hello. I am. What would you like today?" Looking up at the board, Umei took a moment before deciding finally on a bowl of the mixed meat ramen. Noting it down, the waitress turned and headed into the back to pass on the order. It came quite quickly and was the nicest thing Umei had ever tasted, and she quickly tore through it, ordering a second one with a giant grin on her face. Giggled and shouted back to where obviously the kitchens were for a second bowl, a man's voice replying affirmatively a moment later. Reaching backwards to get money from her pouch, Umei suddenly froze as she felt space where it should have been, and frantically began feeling for it, her shock turning to despair as she felt the cut ties on her belt that would have held the money belt in place. Tears came unbidden and she knelt forwards in her seat, her head in her hands as she began to cry, not understanding what she must have done wrong to have earned such a terrible day. A moment later, something was placed heavily on the bench in front of her, and opening her eyes, she found herself staring blearily at her money pouch. Looking to her left, she found the same blonde shinobi from before stood there, smile gone and solemn expression on his face. How? Why? Was all she could mutter through her sharp breaths of relief, and he shook his head before speaking in a defeated tone. I had a couple of clones follow you. As you're new, I thought you might have some trouble. So they alerted me when the thief stole your pouch, and I couldn't not go and retrieve it for you. She leapt at him, engulfing him in a hug even as she saw the waitress look at the shinobi with a smile. Ohio Naruto-kun. Shall I get the Naruto special cooked for you? Umei released him from the hug and looked up to see sadness on his face. Something that she didn't expect seeing, as he was obviously popular enough here to have a meal named after him. The waitress hadn't expected it either if the speed at which she cleared the bar and was in front of the boy was any indication. Naruto, what's happened? Is it to do with today? Because if someone has been causing trouble, I will. She quieted when he handed her a piece of parchment with a heavy sigh, and she looked over it quickly, her eyes widening as she glanced to the bottom before locking eyes with Naruto once more. He didn't, surely he would know. Naruto shook his head even as an elderly man poked his head out of the curtains, giant grin on his face. Did you say Naruto was here? He trailed off as handed him the parchment across the bar. Tucci took a moment longer to read it, squinting at the smaller writing, before his hand formed into fists after placing the paper down in front of Umei, who read it as quickly as she could upside down. Naruto's voice echoed around her as she absorbed the words, surprised at what had happened, both in character and as a shadow clone. None of them had anticipated that this would be an outcome to today's events. Of course he doesn't know. How could he, with the way I have kept it secret all these years? I imagine he thought that the fine would be easy enough to pay off if I actually paid normal prices for anything. I suppose if I sell the apartment block. Seemed to be caught between anger and crying, and judging by the creaking of her pencil in her hands, the former was winning out at this point. At this point, Umei made a decision, not as a shadow clone seeing a way out for his master's problem, but as a young girl who had been raised to repay her debts no matter the personal cost, as the backstory to her character had been. She reached into her money pouch and pulled out the banker's draft she had been given, standing suddenly and walking determinedly over to Naruto, placing it in his hands. He looked at her questioningly for a moment before looking at what she had given him, his eyes widening in shock even as he tried to force it back into her hands. I can't take this. Came up to his shoulder, and her surprise was even more obvious at what was in Naruto's hand as Umei took a step back. Naruto, what is it? Tucci asked confusedly, and it was that answered. It's the girl's money, 5,500 ryo, that must be almost all the money you own. Why are you giving it to Naruto? All three of them, even Naruto at this point, was looking at her with confused expressions, and though she felt the urge to blush or shy away, she stood her ground whilst replying. If it were not for Naruto, this money would be in some thief's pocket anyway, and my parents always taught me to pay my debts to my friends. I think this is a suitable way to repay his kindness to me and a way to help him in his time of need. The next second was a blur, and she panicked before realized that Naruto had picked her up in a lifted hug and was swinging her round with joy. Thank you. Thank you so much, Umei-chan. You are a literal lifesaver. Was crying, though the smile on her face showed that they were of joy as opposed to anything else, whilst Tucci had disappeared into the back once more, muttering about celebration ramen for the lot of them. Seemed to understand him better than Umei had and rushed to the front of the stand, switching the sign from open to closed and pulling the curtains too around the eating area. After a few more moments, Naruto put her down, his expression serious once more, but it was that asked the question that Umei had expected. But seriously, Umei-chan, this is all of your money. How are you going to pay for wherever you are staying? That brought the girl back to reality, and she realized that she had in fact shot herself in the foot by helping Naruto. With no money, the best she could hope for now was that one of the inn owners would take pity and let her stay there and work for the rent money. She saw Naruto's face transform into a smile, however, at the thought, and he spoke up. Hey, Umei-chan. I think I know somewhere you can live if you are still looking. No rent either. This sounded brilliant to Umei, wondering of where Naruto was thinking of. The shadow clone then had to spend a second reminding itself that it knew where he meant. This acting thing was starting to get weird. Composing herself once more, Umei smiled gratefully at him. Really, Naruto-san? Where would that be? He grinned at her, putting his thumb up in a gesture that caused Umei to blush slightly. Why, at my apartment block, of course. It is the least I can do after you gave me your money like that. The old man reappeared with a giant pot of ramen in his arms. Placing it on the counter, he then dealt out 4 bowls, one for each person present. Ayam gave Umei a hug of her own, a giant grin on her face. Welcome to an Ichikawa supper, Umi-chan. It's on the house for helping Naruto-kun tonight as you have done. And as the other 3 members of the small group dug into their food with gusto, Umei couldn't help the feeling of satisfaction and belonging that came with the simple but warming gesture. Persona change, Yugao Yuzuki. Above the stand, Yugao Yuzuki listened in with a small smile as she heard about what the young refugee had done for the boy who she had only met for a few hours. Such selflessness and kindness was rare in the elemental nations, and almost unheard of amongst shinobi, whose very code insisted that emotions and kindness were weaknesses to be purged. Looking down, she perused the check she had written out for the boy she had met all those years ago, first as his silent bodyguard, then as an infrequent acquaintance, and then finally as teacher, helper and friend to a good but lonely soul in a village full of misguided hatred. She thought about tearing up the check. After all, it was a good portion of her available money that was not tied down in her accommodation or savings, so leaving it as it was risky. The number of people who were proficient at pickpocketing and forging made it a liability, especially as she had signed it. But she decided to keep it as it was for now. After all, just because the girl had given him enough money for the fine, that did not mean that he would be living easy until the work hours were paid off. She stood, ready to leave the 4 to their private moment, when she noticed a shimmer out of the corner of her eye. She almost ignored it as she gave it a second glance and sensed nothing, until she felt the light manipulation of her chakra flow that was an indication of a genjutsu. Instantly on guard, she altered her chakra flow and with a muttered "Kai!" she was confronted with a short black cloaked figure, who had obviously also been listening in on the proceedings in the ramen stand beneath them, only to shift their attention to her when she had started getting suspicious. She was across the rooftop in a flash, her tanto drawn and locked with the figure's katana that had been hastily drawn to defend themselves, deflecting her attack away with one hand, leaving her free to press the attack. The next second, however, her vision was clouded with smoke and noise that disrupted her senses for a few seconds. The figure was gone by the time her vision cleared, and she was nowhere near a good enough sensor to try and track the infiltrator by herself. As she went for her pouch to grab an ANBU flare to alert the patrols nearby to an intruder, the rooftop suddenly became filled almost to the brim with Naruto clones, each of which was armed with kunai and ready for a fight. The nearest one relaxed at seeing her, and waved the other clones off as he asked almost jokingly, "Nico-chan, what are you doing here? What was the smoke and noise for? If you wanted my attention, you could have just popped your head in." Yugao was about to ignore him when she realized that the number of clones he had just summoned could be useful. "Naruto-san, I am in pursuit of a cloaked figure that was spying on you, and possibly has been doing for quite some time. Can you have your clones spread out and search for a black cloaked figure with a katana? And also alert the nearby ANBU should you encounter them that this is a level 3 emergency. Authorization, Nico." All joking was gone from the young ninja now as he saluted his order from a superior officer and began directing his clones into search patterns with the beginnings of a grace that only comes from directing the actions of dozens in seamless fluidity. She was surprised that he was also numbering the clones off in numbers and letter combinations as a clone was stood sketching a map of Konoha on a small scroll with little kanji noting search areas for the different groups. In less than 20 seconds, the groups had all dispersed and the original Naruto was stood next to her with a radio in his hand with the same clone stood nearby him with the scroll. He looked over at her, his face questioning even as he spoke. "So Nico-chan, what were you doing here when you noticed the intruder? Not that I don't appreciate you scaring him off or anything. It's just that last time you turned up." He trailed off and Yugao only just resisted pulling the poor boy into a hug. Instead, she decided to maintain her composure and allay his fears. "I was here about that, Naruto, but not in an official sense. I heard what happened and well, this is for you." She held out the check, which he predictably shook his head and hands at before he even looked at how much she was offering. "Nico-chan, you know I can't accept that. It wouldn't be right at all. You've already given me 6,500 ryo over the years. Any more and I will never be able to pay it back." The fact that he had logged how much money she had given him shouldn't have been surprising, but it made her feel that she was correct in looking after him regardless. The refugee girl called up from below and Naruto turned to respond to her, giving Yugao the chance she needed. She slipped the check into his pocket with practiced ease and then activated the hand seals for a shushin, grabbing the Naruto clone as she finished the last seal. Appearing on a rooftop not too far from the ANBU headquarters, she turned to the Naruto clone who was looking at her confused at the sudden departure, but cut it off before he could start gabbling. "You are my point of contact for the clones now. Your boss deserves a night off. Now, tell me what your clones have found." She held out the check, which he predictably shook his head and hands at before he even looked at how much she was offering. "Nico-chan, you know I can't accept that. It wouldn't be right at all. You've already given me 6,500 Rio over the years. Any more and I will never be able to pay it back." The fact that he had logged how much money she had given him shouldn't have been surprising, but it made her feel that she was correct in looking after him regardless. The refugee girl called up from below and Naruto turned to respond to her, giving Yugao the chance she needed. She slipped the check into his pocket with practiced ease and then activated the hand seals for a shushin, grabbing the Naruto clone as she finished the last seal. Appearing on a rooftop not too far from the ANBU headquarters, she turned to the Naruto clone who was looking at her confused at the sudden departure, but cut it off before he could start gabbling. "You are my point of contact for the clones now. Your boss deserves a night off. Now, tell me what your clones have found." Persona change. Number 371. Leaping out of sight of another clone of her mark, the member cursed quietly at the boy's fortitude and his surprising levels of planning and tactics with his duplicates. She had already had to destroy 3 clones to avoid them giving away her position completely, but that just seemed to help the other clones hone in on her general area. What was worse was that the ANBU patrols were also using the clones as markers, and they were far more worrying to her than the clones were, as they had already tried to capture her twice. Even if they were not as organized as the clones were, they were much more skilled and dangerous. Almost as if they were listening to her thoughts, from around her several clones dropped from the rooftops. One of them motioned to her with his hands. "You guys keep her busy. I will radio in our exact position." He was cut off from speaking any further rather physically, as the member appeared in front of him in a burst of speed, slicing his throat with her katana before he could react. The clone exploded into smoke, allowing her to break away from the group using her far superior speed. With no other options available, she leapt down to the streets below and with a single motion hefted the manhole cover up and out of the way, allowing her to leap into the sewers even as the remaining clones hurried down after her. Even as she raced away through the labyrinthine tunnels, she heard the clones shouting into their radios what had happened and relaying instructions to the other clones throughout the city. Fortunately, no one knew the sewer systems better than she and the other root members, and 20 minutes later she emerged from one of the manholes away from the village, only after making sure that she was not being observed or followed in any way. Rushing to the nearest hidden entrance she could think of, she did one last scan for chakra signatures, and upon finding none, activated the hidden entrance and dropped inside, the entrance closing behind her and leaving her in darkness. Traversing the corridors into the main parts of the base with ease despite the lack of sight, she flared her chakra to alert the guards that it was her approaching. Due to the fact she was not meant to report for another 4 hours, if she did not announce her presence well in advance, they would react with force to her arrival, in case she was a spy or otherwise compromised. They said nothing upon her arrival, though she could tell that Danzo-sama had already been alerted and was waiting for her. She entered his office and, to prove the point, he was waiting for her, sat back in his chair with an unreadable expression on his face. He spoke calmly, as if the manhunt in the village meant nothing to him. 371, I assume you are here to tell me why you are not currently watching your assigned target, and also why I am receiving reports that there is currently a manhunt going round Konoha for you headed by ANBU and your target's clones? She bowed her head, coming up with the response that logic dictated would end her disgrace fastest. I was detected by the ANBU captain, Yugao Yuzuki Danzo-sama, whilst I was watching over the target. It was only by chance and the target's clones obscuring their sensors that I managed to escape her and her following ANBU members without being forced to use my full abilities, which would have risked battle and possible capture. Danzo looked at her stonily for a moment before sighing almost to himself. Well, some things are for the best, even if it is in a way that I had not necessarily wished. With your detection, Yuzuki will no doubt present this little chase to the Hokage and use it to prove a point. I have no doubt that it will coincide with what she presented to the elders earlier today, about treating the Uzumaki boys' prank as a training exercise. On that note, what were the repercussions of the prank? Sarutobi has been very vague about it to everyone, though 218 tells me that the boy looked absolutely distraught when he left the Hokage Tower earlier this evening. She outlined what she had read of the parchment that Naruto had been showing around the stand, and Danzo didn't even blink. Not surprising, the sort of punishment that the Hokage would deem to be fair, I suppose, and it was his own fault for trying to hide his difficulties. It does help us, however, and I think it is time you reveal yourself to him. That got surprise from her, even if it were barely a flicker in her otherwise stoic countenance. Why would she need to reveal herself to the one she is mean to be watching? But, Danzo-sama, why should I? He raised a hand, and she could tell he was not pleased with her outburst. She herself had been slightly surprised by it, if she was honest. Because, if you reveal yourself to him with his intentions in mind, should you be detected again whilst watching, he can help you escape and evade your pursuers, just as he did tonight. Okay, she really was in trouble if she was being told to enlist the same genin she was spying on to help her with her espionage. But, an order was an order, and she was in enough trouble for her outburst. Hi, Danzo-sama. Shall I just say it is me? Or should I make a reference to our organization? Both were risks to the operation, and as such she did not want to be the one holding the pieces if this came apart. Danzo thought a moment, obviously pleased that she had asked the question, before speaking once more. Make it out that you represent an organization that works for Konoha, nothing more, nothing less, that should stop him refusing your aid out of hand at any rate. Now go, I have work to do before this night is done. With the curt dismissal, she bowed her way out of the room without a word, glad to have gotten away without actual punishment this time. Though she knew that if she spoke out once more in any way that could be seen as emotional, Danzo might decide that she needed to undergo emotional training once more, not something she wished to do again if she could avoid it. With that out of the way, the only thing she had to do now was work out how to contact her target, amidst a search for her by most for the village's elite troops. She knew if she had been capable of emotions more complex than basic loyalty and the few emotions that sometimes forced their way to the surface, she would have been worried about her chances of success, but that's why she was root, they just got the job done regardless of the odds. Time? 8 p.m. Location? Naruto's apartments. After Yugao had dragged off his backup clone, Naruto had taken the unspoken hint that he was to relax for the rest of the evening rather than partake in a manhunt. He and Umei had enjoyed the rest of the ramen the Ichikaras had prepared for him, taking the time to explain why he had run off. Ayam had been particularly worried about his spy and offered for him to stay the night with them rather than in his apartments by himself. He declined the offer graciously. It was not like they were going to try and get to him with all the ANBU out looking for them. Also, on a more morose note, he did not want to put any risk towards those that actually see him as himself. There were far too few of them around as it was. After the two had finished, Naruto had led Umei through the streets of Konoha towards where he lived, showing her all the important areas on the way through that he considered necessary to know about. Arriving at the apartments, Naruto had produced a large set of keys. Removing one, he had given it to Umei before showing her how to unlock the door, had then let her run around the apartments until she found one she liked whilst he returned to his own apartment for a well-earned cup of tea. Turning the key in the lock, he entered his apartment, headed reflexively through the lounge, and was about to enter the kitchen when a voice spoke from behind him, making him jump in the air and spin round, cry upon his lips until he recognized not only the voice but the person sat eating grapes on his couch with a grin on her face. Yugao-chan, why did you do that? You mean person? I could well have died of shock. Standing up while swallowing her last grape, Yugao chuckled. Well, an awesome shinobi, such as yours truly, should be more aware of their surroundings. What if I had been an enemy ninja, such as the spy from tonight? But my traps? How did you get past them without setting any of them off? She grinned at his question, obviously enjoying his anxiety. Naruto, I am an ANBU captain. If I couldn't get past some little pre-genins traps, I wouldn't deserve my title or my rank. Naruto didn't really have a response to that other than muttering about being awesome didn't mean that he knew everything yet. Seemingly understanding that she was not going to get anything else out of him without provoking more conversation, she jerked her thumb towards the door. So, who's the girl that Lil Naruchan is now going to be living with? You seem rather taken with her if the story you told her about her wallet was true. Either that or you did it yourself to ingratiate her towards you. Naruto had never felt so embarrassed in his life at the accusations. Even if Umei had been a real girl he liked, he would never have. Yugao-chan, how could you say that about me? I would never. How did you even? And she's all alone and looked lost. I just lent a hand. His face was bright red at his stuttering attempts at defending himself, and even though her expression didn't change, he knew that inside she was laughing very hard at his current misfortune. Relax, Naruto, I am only kidding. Though she is a nice girl from what I've seen and heard so far, not many would be as selfless as she is with her money. At the mention of the money, Naruto stiffened. He felt awful about having to accept Umei's money. Even if she was a shadow clone of his, it just wasn't right. Thinking back to what had happened, he realized that Umei had mentioned her caravan being attacked by bandits, but Gigi had said that the response team hadn't found anything when they arrived at the scene of the incident. Perhaps he could go check it out and see whether he could find something they had missed. After all, he knew that the Chunin on duty were not always the most attentive when in a hurry. But first he supposed if that was the plan, he had better get it cleared first. Yugao-chan, I know you're off duty now, and that you don't owe me any favors after you gave me that check and helped me out all this time. But I have a request for Gigi about tomorrow, and it will probably sound better coming from you. Time midnight. Location, the Hokage Tower. So, you are telling me that there is someone with allegiance and intentions unknown to us, has managed to infiltrate MY Village for months if not years to spy on our resident container, and this has somehow managed to be overlooked by all those that are meant to be looking out for him until you just happen to get lucky whilst going to visit him? And then even after detecting the interloper they managed to escape from you, 3 ANBU squads and a pre-genin you forcefully recruited on the night before his official graduation. With said pre-genin, the only one to come remotely close to apprehending the intruder with his clones during the chase round Konoha. It was safe to say that Sarutobi was not amused in the slightest by the events of the evening thus far, especially considering the subject of the discussion definitely did not view the old leader in a favorable light at the moment. He finished his lecture with a tired sigh, looking at Yugao who was stood at attention, cat mask in place and ANBU uniform perfectly set without a stain or smudge on it despite having just finished searching again through the sewers for the very intruder they were discussing right now after ensuring the safety of the intruder's targets by visiting him and ensuring he had returned safe. Yugao still thought that the more telling part about the deficiencies in Konoha's security was Naruto's earlier prank that effectively immobilized half of Konoha's standing forces and a good portion of their infrastructure for most of the day. An infiltrator was par for the course in a ninja village, and it was not like the villagers made it any secret who the container was when they went about their daily routine. In all honesty, it was surprising that there had not been any abduction or enticement attempts from the other ninja villages towards the young boy. Remembering that she should probably answer the semi-serious accusations of incompetence from her superior towards her and her men. The intruder was very skilled with both sight and auditory genjutsu, to the point that it was only mere luck on my part that I noticed a slight distortion that I assume was their reaction to my presence. Also, they were capable of suppressing their chakra to the point that their chakra signature became lost amongst the natural emissions of Naruto and his clones. This meant that the only way of us trying to apprehend them was when they were moving too fast to maintain an illusion whilst being pursued by Naruto's clones. She paused for breath. Sarutobi, waiting patiently for her continue, sat forward in his seat, hands crossed under his chin expectantly. We came close several times to engaging them in a full battle, but they used various escape jutsu to build up the distance and sow confusion in our ranks. The only good point about this debacle is that both Tori and Oni in Squad 2 say they have a good enough red on their chakra that should the intruder arise again, they will be able to track her down as long as we don't flood the air with Naruto's chakra once more. Having concluded her report, she waited for Sarutobi to comment. Well, at least Naruto has some proper combat experience, even if he doesn't consciously remember it. This does help prove the point you were making from earlier today though. We might have become a little too lax in security and apprehension if Naruto does a better job of cornering a suspect than the village's elite. Remembering her earlier conversation with Naruto at the conclusion of the chase, Yugao decided to bring up his request so that the Hokage wouldn't think that she was hiding things from him once more. Speaking of Naruto Hokage-sama, during our conversation at the conclusion of the pursuit, he made a request that whilst a bit out of the ordinary, I personally am inclined to grant him. She paused and the Hokage waited patiently for her to continue, a technique he had perfected with 2 children and 2 grandchildren. He wishes to have an attempt at following the bandits he asked you about yesterday. He and the refugee girl who had managed to escape the attack are becoming fast friends, so I think he wants to do it to try and help her. Yugao left out the fact that he may feel obliged to do it because of the money the girl had given him. Best to let the old man sweat about the money issue a while longer before informing him of the good news on that front. Even without her saying anything, Sarutobi seemed to understand that there was more to this situation than meets the eye, but rather than try and dig for news about his unofficial grandson once more in regards to his relationship with the girl from out of town, an area that he did not wish to deal with again if at all possible, especially after the complications with his daughter Kasumi. He instead decided to try and focus on the boy's request itself and the practicality issues associated with. My main query in regards to the request is simple. Why does Naruto seem to think that he can perform any better than the squad of Chunin that I assigned to the investigation yesterday? They found a trail that barely continued for half a mile before it petered out into nothing, like the attackers just took flight and left without further trace. Yugao waited a moment to see if he would continue before speaking her piece. Even if he were to fail to uncover anything new, it would be a good experience for Naruto, and it would give him some peace of mind when dealing with his new friend. I believe though that if there is something to be found there, he will be the one to find it. After all, he did manage to pull off a complete search of almost 3 districts of Konoha today in less than 2 hours with no preparation time and very limited support thanks to his clones and huge chakra reserves, which he coordinated and controlled surprisingly well all considering. I believe he will be able to pull of a similar solution here. The bandits can't have hidden their tracks so well for long with loot and captives to worry about as well. Sarutobi conceded that point with a gracious nod before continuing his argument. Even so, today is his graduation day, and despite the fact that it won't matter too much if he is late because I sanctioned this mission for him, it will not help him fit in with his comrades and teammates if he is seen to be getting special treatment from me. Despite her professional attitude, Yugao could not help but scoff at this statement. He has just completed an unofficial B-rank mission in capturing Mizuki, and yet an unranked unpaid mission is too far? Have you seen what the clan heirs have been being taught outside the normal curriculum both inside and outside the academy? If anything, they are the ones you should be worried about in Naruto's graduating set. Sarutobi knew that he had to concede the point once more. The Uchiha had been considered the best thing since the Yondaime by the civilian populace and some of the ninja, regardless of their opinion of the Jutsu stealing clan before they were massacred by one of their own. And the other major clan heirs, who almost entirely were present in this one graduating class, were taught by their families to be able to protect themselves and their secrets from a young age. Fine, I know what you mean. So then, we have to now decide how many hours of his service we can say he worked back tonight, as you did technically enlist him in your investigation. Kami forbid that I let him use shadow clone hours as his own. He would be done with his punishment in a couple of days, and despite how harsh it has turned out to be from what you have told me, he is coping okay thus far, and it will be a good lesson for him in the future. With this statement, the 2 shinobi sat to negotiate further on the specifics of the agreement that had been done that day. What they did not know was that at the same time in the slums of Konoha, another meeting was taking place, with the object of their discussion being an unwilling participant. Point of view, Naruto Uzumaki. Naruto was usually surprisingly bad at getting up when woken before he was ready for it, but returning to consciousness with a sword blade to your throat has a very awakening effect. Doing his best not to move in what could be in any way remotely considered a threatening manner, he opened his eyes, shifting his vision to look over at the cloaked figure that was holding their katana to presumably pacify him. He spoke quietly, so as not to startle the intruder into acting rashly. You know, if you are going to kill me, you could at least have let me sleep through it. He grinned at his own dark humor, his sleepy mind not registering that aggravating someone who has you at sword point was probably an inadvisable move. To his surprise, the figure spoke back to him, in an obviously female tone. To kill you was not the purpose of my visit, Naruto-san. I merely wished to ensure that you did not overreact to my presence upon waking, and this seemed the most logical way for me to do that. After all, it would be hard for me to hold a proper discussion with you whilst trying to battle off hordes of your clones. There was no humor, sarcasm, or anything in the girl's tone, though Naruto was still tempted to take her last comment as a joke and chuckle to it accordingly. She spoke blandly without a hint of emotion in her voice, leading Naruto to shake off his attempts at humor and instead go for the no-nonsense approach in trying to negotiate with the girl, well as no-nonsense as he could be. So you are here to talk to me rather than attack me? If I promise to sit quietly and listen to what you say, will that be sufficient compliance for me to ensure that you remove your negotiation equipment from its current resting place? Nothing, not even a twitch. He was going to have to work a lot harder to elicit a reaction by the looks of it. After a moment's pause, she spoke once more, lifting her blade to rest against her shoulder as she stepped back from the bed. That is acceptable as a deal, Naruto-san. So if you would sit up and make yourself comfortable, I can begin. Deciding not to keep her waiting, he sat up, watching her closely. It was at this point that he affirmed to himself that this was the same person who he had spent the evening chasing, and voiced this in order to be sure. "Are you the person who was spying on me earlier this evening?" "I think you are, but just wanted to be sure." She nodded once. "That is correct, and is actually part of the discussion that I wish to have with you. I work for part of an organization, and we take a vested interest in ensuring that Konoha continues to prosper and grow strong. As you know of your tenant now, you will be able to understand why we have been keeping our eye on you all these years, doing our best to help you from the shadows when nobody else would." As she said this, Naruto's mind was cast back to his younger years, when those who would try and chase him or hurt him were either distracted, incapacitated, or otherwise stopped from getting to him, well before his supposed carers even tried to intervene. He had always thought that it was Yugao or one of her ANBU that had been protecting him, but she had claimed no knowledge of it occurring, adding weight to the cloaked girl's claim. Seeing that he was not going to speak again, the girl started speaking once more in the same monotone that she had used since the start of this rather odd interaction. "We also know of what you have been doing since the incident with the traitor Mizuki. Your little addition to Konoha's populace was very cleverly done, even though with your childish goals for this you have not realized what you have uncovered with this move." That worried Naruto. After all, if these people knew of what he had been doing when even the Hokage had been kept in the dark, he wondered what other information they would be able to get hold of if they wished. Obviously sensing his anxiety, the girl held up her hand in a placating gesture. "Calm yourself, Uzumaki-san. Your secret is safe with us. As I said, we see uses for what you have done, even if you have not yet realized them for yourself. After all, consider it this way. You have just managed to infiltrate someone into the greatest and supposedly strongest village in the elemental nations, have gotten them into close proximity of one of the village's greatest assets, namely you, and no one has raised an eyebrow at it, meaning that if she was a proper infiltrator, she could carry out her espionage and sabotage operations without initial worry about being detected at all." Okay, he definitely had not thought of it that way when he came up with his initial plan to wow Sakura with his dating skills. When it was put like that, it did highlight how lax security in Konoha had gotten, especially as he had had no training in the subject at all. This did raise a pertinent question, however, that he felt needed to be answered now. "But why are you interested in this? From what you have told me and with my experience of the chase earlier this evening, you are definitely not part of Konoha's official forces and that you do not report to the Hokage, so why would this security lapse worry you?" That got a reaction from her, as her hands tightened into fists, and when she spoke there was a hint of anger in her tone, the first emotion he had heard or seen expressed in the whole conversation. "Think what you will, but I assure you that you will find none in Konoha more devoted to the village than us." This time it was Naruto who was doing the pacifying. He asks an honest question and nearly gets his head taken off for it. "Okay, I believe you, lady, no need to get angry now. I was just wondering what this had to do with me then. It's not like I can change the security of Konoha. Why don't you just bring it up with the Hokage?" She sighed to herself, shaking her head in the same way that one would do so when looking at a 5-year-old who has been hopelessly naive, and Naruto got the feeling that what he had just said was a pretty silly thing to say somehow. "If only it were so easy for us to address the issue, then we would not need to involve you in the slightest. The reason we need you is that the Hokage does not view us in the best light, due to the different ways that we think that Konoha should be protected from forces both internal and external. The use for your plan that we have seen and would like for you to carry out is to simply keep the ruse going until the end of the year, regardless of whether or not the plan succeeds, as this is the length of time usually given for a deep cover operative to complete their mission. Then, we shall present the evidence to the Hokage, which should hopefully be enough to force him to take preventative action against future possible attempts at infiltrations." Naruto thought for a moment before nodding in agreement to the suggestion. "I can do that. I was planning on keeping her around for a while regardless, as it would not be good for her to just suddenly disappear. People would just claim that I had killed her and hidden the body." Not the sort of accusation he wished to particularly face a biased civilian court over. Another question popped into his head as the girl shrugged in a non-committal fashion to his previous statement. "If you and I are going to effectively be partners on this, as I imagine the fewer of you I know about the less risk for the both of us, how am I meant to contact you with updates and stuff?" She shrugged once more, stepping back further into the shadows of his room before replying. "Really, Uzumaki-san? You should know by now that it's when I contact you we meet. You trying to arrange it will just end badly. Until next time." And with that she was gone into the darkness, silence pervading the room and unnerving Naruto slightly, even as he cursed silently about useless traps that seemed incapable of deterring anyone from entering his apartment whenever they wished. Time. 7:45 a.m. Location: Naruto's apartment. He woke up early the next morning, his mind troubled now by the events of the previous day. First he gets in a huge amount of trouble with the Hokage, then he gets held a sword point by someone who he had spent the evening chasing round Konoha, before effectively agreeing to deceive the entire population of Konoha for almost 4 months in partnership with an obviously covert organization that did not work for the Hokage. He was fairly certain that most if not all of that would be classed as treasonable on some level or another. But there was not a lot that he could do about it now, and he had to be ready should Yugao agree to his request to go and have a look at the site where Umei was attacked yesterday, in the hope that he would be able to discover something towards the outcome of the attack. This would be helpful towards his original plan, the one he had devised initially before all these complications got added to it, as if he did find something Umei could then come and thank him at the end of the academy today, which would be a good way to introduce her to the rest of the class so that they wouldn't find it weird when she just appeared as they started dating. After thinking on his problem for another 10 minutes, he finally decided the best he could do was to go along with the plan as it was for now, and that if the scary girl appeared again and asked him something unreasonable, he would throw himself at Yugao's mercy and explain everything to her then. This line of thought made one last glaring consequence of yesterday spring into his head, and he sighed dejectedly as he thought it through and came to a conclusion. He was going to have to send some clones to the library of all things. Naruto really didn't like the library, he was much more of a get-out-and-do-it person, but considering his currently self-designed traps weren't cutting it in the slightest, he was evidently going to have to up his game somewhat in order to try and reduce the number of intruders that he received every night. Before he could think upon the matter any further, there were 4 loud but rhythmic knocks at the door, making him curse quietly for getting distracted and not creating some clones to go off to the library when he first thought of them. Thinking quickly, he called up his chakra whilst he grabbed some food. 6 clones burst into existence, one running off to the door whilst the others transformed into various animals and left through cracks in walls or through windows, making sure to stay out of sight. He heard his clone open the door as he was halfway through his last cookie. "Hi Yugao-chan, the boss won't be a minute, he's just finishing breakfast. Are you here about our request? Or is Gigi going to try and steal even more of our money?" There was silence for a moment before a proofing sound and Yugao's voice calling into the flat. "Naruto-san, what have I told you? You really need to improve your manners now that you are a ninja. And you shouldn't be mad with the Hokage. It was you that hid your money troubles from him after all, so he wasn't to know." Naruto rushed to the entrance as she continued speaking, appearing at the door as she spoke once more. "And in regards to your request, the Hokage has approved for you to do an unranked mission to investigate the caravan attack site, though he has insisted you be back by noon, so that you are not late for your graduation at 2. Graduation? That had not entered Naruto's mind with all the work he had been doing over the last week. Was that really today? Shaking off his confusion as to where all the time had gone, he instead grinned apologetically at Yugao. "Sorry Yugao-chan, the clones are a bit rowdy at the best of times. Also, I apologize, you have been doing a lot of things for me over the last 24 hours. I will make it up to you, I promise." He then thought about what she had said a little more. "So it's just me then? Or are you sending along someone to keep an eye on me?" Yugao's face softened slightly at this and she reached forward to ruffle his hair slightly. "Not with you as such, I will be at taking you to the western gate where we will meet the Chunin due to patrol the area where the attack took place. She will lead you there, then continue her patrol of the area whilst you search. She will in effect be in charge of you during this time, so show her proper respect and report anything you find to her during or at the end of the search. Now are you ready to go?" He nodded eagerly, grabbing her shoulder as she went through a string of hand seals, and then in a burst of speed they were gone. Arriving at the gate, Naruto found a tall thin young woman with long black hair and a Chunin's flak jacket on over typical ninja fatigues that fitted her loosely enough to allow for free movement but not too loose as to become a liability in a taijutsu battle. "Naruto, this is Himako. She will be your effective leader and point of contact on this mission. Here is a personal radio for each of you to keep in touch with each other with. I must be getting back to my duties now." Handing each of them a headset, she disappeared in a swirl of leaves, leaving the 2 of them alone. Himako's smile was one of the most fake that Naruto had ever seen. She was obviously not happy with him in the slightest, though whether that was because he was forcing her to do extra work on her patrol, or whether it was to do with what he contained, he couldn't be quite sure and didn't really want to find out. He bowed deferentially before properly introducing himself. "Hello Himako Taishu. Thank you for helping me with this. I won't be any trouble, I promise." Himako snorted and a thin smirk covered her face as she looked at him once more. That's what we all thought when you graduated at last. It took me hours to get all the glue and feathers out of my hair, and that uniform still has splashes of orange on it. Ah, so that's why she didn't particularly like him right now. Another consequence of his little plan that he hadn't thought of before enacted it. Reflexively, he reached back with his left hand and scratched the back of his head whilst grinning in what he hoped looked like an apologetic manner. Gomen Himako Taishu, I imagine you aren't the only one annoyed at me for that one. I just needed to blow off some steam after being told something really bad. And at least I made sure the glue was water-soluble? She looked thoughtful at this, and Naruto expected she assumed that he had been told about being the container of the Kyuubi. She spoke after a moment, her tone a lot less accusatory this time. Well, if the news was what I think it was, I can't blame you for being upset with a lot of us. Besides, from what I hear, you received more than a big enough punishment. So, I will put it behind me, and make sure that the others know why you did it if you behave yourself this morning and listen to the orders that I give you. Naruto nodded rapidly. If it stopped her being so passively aggressive towards him, then that was not a bad deal in the slightest. With this affirmation, she turned away and walked out the gate, nodding at the guards as she passed them. Neither of them Naruto recognized, but he followed quickly as she broke into jog down the road, before jumping into the trees on the left-hand side of the road a moment later. Naruto cursing at the increase in pace before jumping after her as quickly as he could. 40 agonizing minutes later, Naruto dropped from the trees to the side of the road, his face red and his breath ragged and shallow. Himako dropped from where she had stopped and grinned not a little vindicatively at him. You need to work a lot on your speed, Naruto-san. Whilst acceptable for an academy student, as a genin you will be expected to be considerably faster than you are now. Naruto didn't respond for a minute apart from looking up at her like she was crazy. He had effectively just performed a 40-minute sprint at his top speed, which would not have been possible if not for his insane stamina that he had gained as a container, and even that had been pushed to its absolute limit with that effort. Any of his classmates would have been left in the dirt long before now, so she was either a very harsh taskmaster and judge, or his graduation were well below par where it mattered. Choosing not to get involved in what would be a pointless argument, Naruto instead managed to wheeze out what he considered to be a pertinent line of inquiry. Is this the location of the attack? Her grin was a little unnerving as she replied. This is about 2/3 of the way to the destination, but you looked like you needed a break. We continue in 10 seconds. His heart and face plummeted. Another 20 minutes like that? There was no way he was going to survive that. I was only joking, Naruto-san. This is the location. We removed the burned-out carts so that they did not affect people's willingness to travel this road. You really should have seen your face then. This had to be revenge for his prank. Naruto grumbled as he glared at the now giggling Chunin who was enjoying torturing him far too much for his liking. After a few seconds, she stopped giggling and straightened up. But on a more serious note, the investigating Chunin found the burning wagons here, and a trail leading that way to the west of here. The problem is that the trail vanishes after a half-mile or so, as if the bandits just vanished into thin air, and despite searching the surrounding woodland, they were unable to find any further clues as to their location on passage. She paused for breath and looked him in the eye. I don't know how you expect to do any better than they did with this, but I wish you the best of luck, Naruto-san. I will be back in 3 hours to return you to Konoha. Be ready by that time. If you need to report anything to me before then, I will set the radio Nico Taishu gave me to channel 3 and you can report it through that. And with that she was gone, back into the trees, leaving Naruto by himself to observe his surroundings. To both sides of him were the famous Konoha woodlands, created by the Shodaime and maintained by Konoha to this day, as a natural defensive terrain that they flourished in fighting in. The trail was easy enough to spot, broken branches and disturbed foliage pointing the way for pursuit. Using the correct hand seal, Naruto called on a good portion for his pretty much only useful technique. Kagebushin no Jutsu. In an eruption of smoke, over 100 Kagebushin appeared around him. Right, you guys know what you are doing. Follow the trail until it disappears, then fan out, search areas in sections, no crossing over. The clones saluted, then ran into the woods with a cheer. They would find something. There were too many of them not to. Chapter 9. The discovery and graduation begins. Half an hour later, Naruto was ready to scream in frustration at the lack of anything substantial discovered by his clones during their hunt. It was like Himako had said. The trail continued for almost a mile, before vanishing in the middle of a small clearing in the dense woodland. His clones had searched almost 10 square miles around the area with nothing to show for it other than a new appreciation of the dangers of wasps to his clones when they were angered. In an attempt to take his mind off the problem, he walked down the road, kicking his feet against the ground as he tried to think of what he and his clones had missed. Had the bandits backtracked after making the trail? Not likely. There would not have been enough time with Umei escaping as she did, and the hostages and loot were too heavy to lug around on such a plot. Kicking his left foot on the ground once more, Naruto took another step before his mind caught up with what his eyes had seen. Stopping, he looked back to make sure he hadn't been seeing things, but sure enough there it was. Underneath the top levels of soil that he had just kicked off in his frustration was a dried but still red splash of blood on the soil, and not an insignificant one at that. He created 10 more clones to search the rest of this section of road whilst he thought about what he may have stumbled upon. Thinking back to what Himako had said, they had found the burning wagons where she had dropped him off, but Umei distinctly remembered 2 of the caravan guards being killed before she fled the attack site, so there surely would have been bodies and blood at the site. But Himako hadn't mentioned anything and neither had Naruto seen any. The clones had quickly uncovered several more large pools of dried blood under the top layers of soil and dirt, which meant that this had to be where the attack took place, not where the wagons had been found. He activated his earpiece, which effectively connected him to every clone that was within range, speaking slowly and angrily. "Boys, head back to the road. I think that these bandits have pulled the wool over our eyes, and I really don't like when that happens." He removed his finger, the clones not replying to his statement but undoubtedly listening to him, and then he sat at the side of the road, the 10 clones beginning to search both sides of the road and being steadily reinforced by clones arriving from the failed search to the north. Settling himself in, he began to think in an attempt to work out how the bandits had pulled off the raid. The idea that the bandits, after having captured the caravan and its occupants, decided to move the caravans away from the attack site did not take long to occur to him, but why move it if you can vanish your trail whenever you like? Surely it was more trouble than it is worth. A cough from in front of him brought him back to reality, and opening his eyes he found a clone looking down at him, face serious and eyes ablaze. "Boss, you are going to need to take a look at this yourself." Jumping up, he followed his clone quietly into the woodlands to the southeast of the new attack site. They had gone almost 400 yards before the smell of death hit him, and breaking the foliage in front of him, the clone revealed a pile of corpses, more than a dozen at least, stripped of anything valuable, including weapons, jewelry, and earrings that looked like they were torn out with no respect for the dead whatsoever. Half of them seemed to be guards, killed during the fighting, though the others make no sense. The one on top's an old woman. She can't have been fighting them. The clone was obviously suffering from shock as he stared at the scene, the other clones in the vicinity steering well clear of the clearing in their search for anything else that might prove useful in the hunt for those that did this. Looking at the old woman more closely, Naruto realized something from the looks of her wounds. She wasn't killed during the fighting. She was killed after it had all finished, her throat slit from behind. The bandits must have thought she was worthless as a captive, or that she would slow them down in their withdrawal. With such a morbid thought, Naruto decided that he was out of his depth now and definitely had something that counted as worth reporting to Himako. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out the radio that Yugao had given him before he had left Konoha. Turning it on, he twisted the dial on the front so that the arrow's point on it pointed at the kanji for the number 3. Pressing the activation button on it, he spoke somewhat hesitantly into the set as he desperately tried to remember what the academy had told him about the terms and other semantics that were associated with radio communication. "Himako Taishu, this is Naruto. Can you read me over?" There was an audible sigh before he got an actual verbal response. "This is Himako. I read you loud and clear. Have you decided to give up on your little tracking exercise over?" He had to try very hard not to get angry at the derision in her statement, instead concentrating on relaying the information he had across to her. "No, in fact, I have found evidence that the attack site you dropped me off at is in fact a decoy. I have a pile of bodies to prove it." There was a moment's pause before Himako replied once more, this time shock evident in her tone. "Are you sure?" "Of course you are, ignore that. I am on my way to the original site now. I shan't be more than 10 minutes. Have a clone meet me there and lead me to where you are now. Any signs of a trail from your position away from the road?" A clone that had evidently been listening in to the conversation raised his head so he was visible over the foliage and pointed further southeast before gesturing uncertainly with his hands. Reading the gesture as best as he could, Naruto replied, My clones think they have found some away to the southeast, though with all the animal tracks to and from the bodies, it is not easy to be sure. I will have them spread out and look in that direction. Understood. I am inbound now. And Naruto-san, well done with this discovery, Himako-chan over and out. He felt a welling of pride at the praise, but it drained out of him as he looked into the old woman's dead eyes. Turning away, he leapt back into the trees, communicating the plan to his clones once more. Landing on the road once more, he began to piece together what had actually happened the day before. Bandits had attacked from where he now was, removing the captives and loot once they had pacified the guards. Then they had split up, some taking the wagons and heading up the road before burning them, some working to disguise the signs of the engagement that had taken place, and others leading away the captives and carrying the loot and bodies. This was no small bandit group carrying out these attacks. The strategy itself was complex enough to make Naruto think that rogue samurai were probably involved in some way. The radio buzzed to life with news that the clones had established an actual trail that lined up with what he had deduced to be the size of the bandit force, and he told them to follow it, being wary of traps and other deceptions. If the group were this organized, they would leave little to chance. True enough, by the time that Himako had arrived at the decoy site, more than a dozen clones had fallen to traps laid on the trail. She walked over to him, seriousness written all across her face. Report, I want to see this evidence before I report it in and ask for backup. A thought struck Naruto at this point. What if the bandits, instead of passing as had been thought to the west, and then disappearing into thin air, had made that trail before the caravan had arrived, and then attacking and moving the caravans forward to that point? To do so would not only require knowledge of what caravans were using which roads, but also the rota of Konoha patrols in the region, in order to not get caught unawares whilst creating the trail. For such a case to be true, that would imply. He shivered at the thought, before starting to speak. Before we do that, how long before the attack would you say that someone patrolled this section of road? She looked at him confusedly. No more than an hour or two. Why is that important? With that piece of information, Naruto laid out what he had found, leading her down the road to where the blood was, and his theory about the fake trail. That implication brought her to a halt as she looked at him disbelievingly. Are you implying there is someone in Konoha that is passing information about the caravans to the bandits? That's quite an accusation to be making there, Naruto. She looked round the clearing with the bodies once more before sighing. But what you have found certainly points a finger that way. If that's the case, then I will wait until we have investigated a little further before I call it in. Then it looked like something occurred to her and a grin worked its way onto her face. Assuming that the bandits aren't too far away from us, then you're going to be late for your graduation, I'm afraid, Naruto-san. He looked at her, what she was talking about. What do you mean, Himako Taishu? I thought we were just going to do a bit more investigating before we head back. She looked at him like he was stupid. You serious? If we come across them and think we can handle them, we are definitely not risking the possibility of you being right and a leak in Konoha warning them off. Stick with me, kid, and I will make a hero of you yet. Chapter break. Time skip 1 hour. Screw being a hero, Naruto thought. If it weren't for the fact that they currently perched outside what seemed to be the entrance of the bandit base, he would have called it quits and told Himako to call reinforcements a while ago. The girl seemed to have forgotten about his supposedly subpar speed, and as such, when they had discovered an easily followable position about half a mile from the clearing, where Naruto had left 30 clones to dig some graves for the poor victims, she had sped off like nothing else. He had very quickly ordered his clones to disperse. They were just hampering his attempts at trying to keep up. The only advantage of the situation was that he managed to finally finish a move that he had been working on, which utilized bursts of chakra to his leg muscles to boost his speed, and though it took a few rather catastrophic attempts, he managed to iron out the technique enough to catch Himako, who had slowed to let him catch up once more. He had no idea where they were, other than the fact they were now deep into the wild lands of Konoha, thick woodlands which were prowled by predators that could even make a shinobi give pause if caught by surprise. The bandit base seemed to be built to keep those creatures out, depending on its location to prevent it being found by anyone else, with a palisade wall surrounding it, a single entrance which had 2 very bored guards, and 4 ramshackle guard towers that served as the limits of the fortifications. Whilst Himako had scouted the perimeter, he had used a tactic he had discovered the week before. When humans transformed into other things, they maintained their original weight, which was a disadvantage when, say, one pretended to be a kunai or a cat. As shadow clones were made of chakra, they could actually manipulate their weight to whatever they wished. Therefore, the hinged clones that were disguised as birds could actually fly, allowing Naruto to scout the inside of the base from the air using them, and several clones disguised as mice covered the ground. He discovered that there were about 40 bandits up and about, either drinking, eating, or otherwise lazing around whilst being waited upon by almost 24 ragged individuals which had to be the ones that they had captured from the caravan. There were another 60 or so bandits sleeping either in the tents that littered the clearing, or inside the natural cave formation that probably also contained their leader. Upon her return, Himako had come to the same conclusion he had when he had told him what he had discovered, that they needed backup regardless of the risk of a traitor in their ranks. Taking on that many bandits with hostages was suicide. Himako leapt back into the trees to call in their find, as well as to try and work out their exact coordinates on the map she had with. Meanwhile, Naruto decided to leap round through the trees to the southwestern guard tower, which he had noted was currently unoccupied through the use of his clones. Leaping up into the tower, he looked down into the camp physically for the first time. His clone's vision had been fairly accurate, if a little limited in terms of from the perspectives that they had taken the views from. The mental picture of the camp that he had built up using their information had not been correct in terms of the rise up to the cave formation that he had not noticed in either form, and the heights of all the tents and other things had been slightly off. Suddenly, he was distracted from his thoughts by a female scream from one of the tents not too far from his position, and a moment later a large burly semi-naked bandit, with an eye patch over one eye and a black beard, stormed out of a tent facing Naruto, grasping the hair of a girl who could not have been more than 13 by the hair, her ragged clothes ripped down the front. What caught Naruto's attention more than anything else was the bloody wound in the bandit's shoulder even as he threw the girl to the floor in front of him. One of the bandits that had been lounging by a fire a few meters from the scene called over to the injured bandit with obvious humor. "This one giving you trouble then? That's another scar you can pretend to have gained on the battlefield." There were bursts of laughter around the camp even as the large bandit turned red. "I just wanted a piece of something before the boss moves them on up to the meeting point, and then just as I was about to start, the girl up and stabs me." The girl forced herself to her feet, spitting at the bandit's foot before readying the small knife she had in her hand once more. "That was for Bachan, you bastard. Next time I will get your black heart instead of your shoulder." With that she charged forwards, swinging the knife with such lack of skill that Naruto couldn't help but wince at. The bandit dodged the blow with a growl, batting the girl away with a crack, looming over her as she gasped into the earth, drawing a deadly-looking axe. "Well, you will serve as the example not to mess with us then, and I will make sure to go after your sister right afterwards." Naruto didn't consciously remember moving at all. One second he was watching in horror, the next second he was rocketing into the camp, his fist making a heavy impact with the bandit's face, sending him to the floor even as Naruto grabbed the axe from his surprised hands. Straightening up from his move and collecting his thoughts, Naruto looked round nervously as the other bandits jumped to their feet warily, drawing their assortment of weapons. He realized the disadvantage of his position, essentially alone against almost 100 bandits, with 30 captives to protect and only half a dozen disguised clones that were currently undetected in a position to protect them. In addition, he hadn't filled his weapon pouch when he had woken up that morning, so he only had 3 kunai and 6 shuriken in addition to the bloody great big axe that he had just appropriated from the fallen bandit. Deciding to use a bit of bravado in an attempt to bolster his faltering confidence, he grinned and stepped forward, speaking loudly in what he hoped was a confident tone. "Greetings, please find yourselves under arrest for murder, theft, and slavery. By the law of the Fire Daimyo, I do hope you plan on coming peacefully." After a few moments one of the bandits burst out laughing, many of the others joining in, the one that started eventually recovering enough to wheeze out his question. "That's funny, kid, real funny. You plan on arresting us? You in what army?" At that comment Naruto couldn't help but grin, even as he whacked the downed bandit over the head with the haft of the axe as he tried to stand, knocking him out properly this time before hefting the axe to rest on his shoulder, freeing his hands to form a single hand sign, many of the bandits stiffening as he did so. "Well, as you asked for it, I was thinking this one would suffice." And then in a cloud of chakra smoke, all hell broke loose in the fortified encampment. Point of view, Irika Umino, Chunin of Konoha. Naruto was 20 minutes late for the actual Team Sensei meeting, and more than an hour late for the academy graduation in general, Irika thought wryly. At this rate he would be later than his assigned teacher, and though Irika loathed Kakashi's lateness as much as the next ninja, he didn't want Naruto to give the man a reason to fail his team before his infamous test tomorrow. though he had doubts over whether the team the Hokage had put together would have any hope of passing the copy Nin's infamous bell test. He remembered back to when he had been assigning the teams more than an hour ago, and when he had named Naruto as part of Team 7, Sakura had spoken up in a confused and slightly angry tone. But sensei, Naruto Baka failed the test to graduate as a ninja, so why have you called his name out, especially as he isn't here? Deciding to try and avoid the question about Naruto's location, he had instead chosen to divulge the truth in somewhat brief terms about Naruto's graduation, including him beating Mizuki, though he left out how he had done so. By the end of the tale, the class was silent, several of them looking very impressed with Naruto's work. But the Uchiha had just scoffed and stated that Mizuki could not have been very strong if the Dobe had managed to have beaten him. Irika ignored the jab at his own skills with that comment, and had replied that Mizuki had beaten the Uchiha around the taijutsu ring when the Uchiha had challenged him to a no-holds-barred contest as a challenge, so maybe that made Naruto stronger than the Uchiha in that case. The Uchiha's fuming face still brought a grin to his face, as the third sensei, the beautiful Yuhi Kurenai, came to collect Team 8, comprising of the Inuzuka, Hyuga and Aburame clans' heirs. Her collection was interrupted, however, by a flurry of leaves that inferred a leaf shushin technique at the front of the room, a couple of feet from him in fact. From the flurry appeared two figures, one of which he instantly recognized as his classmate Himako, who looked a little roughed up but otherwise okay. It took him another moment to recognize the other figure, who looked like he had been thrown through a meat grinder. Naruto's upper clothing was in tatters, his trademark jacket gone and his t-shirt only just capable of being considered wearable, though considering the blood covering it from top to bottom, similar to his trousers that were now a cross between red and orange, some of it Naruto's judging by the vast number of cuts, grazes, and other wounds that were visible on his upper body. The boy quickly turned on the spot, and spotting him through the one eye that wasn't swollen shut, stood to attention and snapped off a very wobbly salute. Irika-sensei, sorry for being late to the graduation class, but believe me, I have one hell of an excuse. Catching the amused and slightly resigned look on Himako's face, Irika got the feeling that for once, Naruto was actually understating himself entirely. Chapter 10. The Storytelling. Naruto felt like crap, even more than he had been thus far today, and it wasn't just because he had been having to keep up with Himako again, though that had certainly not helped in the slightest. He had just raced back to Konoha after the fight of his life, only to wait for an hour for his sensei, some weirdo jounin by the name of Kakashi Hatake. One advantage of the team he was in was that he had Sakura on his team, which would help progress Project Shadow considerably, if everything went according to plan of course. Despite the joy he felt at this revelation, Naruto was honestly too tired to be able to try and talk to her, instead collapsing semi-comatose in one of the middle rows whilst trying to regain some of his energy. It had worked to an extent, so that by the time Kakashi had finally deigned them with his presence, Naruto had regained at least a fraction of his usual functionality, even if every movement hurt. After exclaiming at the top of his voice in an angry tone that Kakashi was a crap sensei for being late, and forcing him to sprint back to Konoha for no good reason, the man had simply turned around and stated that he hated all of them, and that they should meet him on the roof for introductions. Deciding to save himself some effort, Naruto decided instead of using the stairs to utilize his new chakra leaping technique to launch himself up to the roof with the aid of a clone to push off against. Whilst he had obviously surprised the man with the maneuver, the man had not commented and simply had waited for the other two arrive whilst reading his orange book and giggling on occasion. Once they had arrived, showing their own surprise at the sight of Naruto being up on the roof before them, they had then indulged in the most pointless exercise Naruto had ever heard of. Kakashi had asked them all to introduce themselves and tell everyone a little about each other, though when asked to show them what he had meant, he had been vague and not told them anything about him. Having been chosen to go next and still feeling somewhat snarky at the Jounin's late arrival, Naruto had decided to copy his sensei word for word, apart from changing his name of course. This had surprisingly got a smirk from Sasuke and a giggle from Sakura, whilst Kakashi's single visible eye had narrowed at what Naruto had done. The other two hadn't followed suit however, and the only thing that Naruto learned from the exchange was that Sasuke had someone that he wished to kill, though did not elaborate who that was. Naruto assumed it was his older brother, the one who had massacred the rest of the Uchiha clan in a single night, leaving only Sasuke alive, but he would be certain to make sure later, rather than get it wrong and screw up badly. After that, Kakashi had informed them that they hadn't actually truly graduated yet, and that they first had to pass survival training, which would be held tomorrow morning on Training Ground 7 at 7 a.m. He then informed them not to eat breakfast lest they throw up, before bidding them farewell and disappearing in a shushin, off to read his book no doubt. So here he was, sat on rooftop having been told to attend survival training, with no idea of what to expect. Falling back on what seemed to have become his tactic for acquiring information, he summoned 24 clones onto the rooftop, bringing them into huddle. Right, I want you all to spread yourselves across Konoha, transformed into people we know about, so guards, other chunin and such to try and find out everything you can about Kakashi and this survival test of his. You! He declared, pointing at one whilst the others nodded. Go make sure Akko and Yuna have got through admin okay. Then bring them to Ichikaris, tell Iam to put their food on my tab. I will go get Umei and meet them there. The clones all chorused agreement and then dispersed themselves, their forms shifting as they moved into various people, making sure to confer with each other to ensure no one duplicated another. Grinning at what was another clever plan of his, Naruto turned to leave, only to find both of his teammates staring at him in complete shock. It was Sakura who managed to regain the ability to speak first, though it was clear that she was still shocked by something. Naruto, are those solid clones? That was why they were confused. Shadow clones had become so natural to Naruto that he had forgotten that it was not considered the norm anymore. Reaching up and scratching the back of his head, he thought up the best way to respond to her question. An idea popped into his head based on what he had just finished saying to his clone. They are Sakura-chan, shadow clones to be exact. I learnt them the same night I graduated. I would tell you about it, but I've got to go and pick someone up for dinner. I will tell it all to you there if you wish. I'm sure that Umei wouldn't mind hearing about it. She's already in for one hell of a tale as it is. Hook, line and sinker, or at least that's what Naruto thought the phrase was. He could tell Sakura was more than interested enough to be turning up later. Sasuke was much harder to read, but he wasn't nearly as important, so it didn't matter too much to Naruto whether he was interested. Speaking of Umei, he had better get going. He hadn't told his clone where he had been going today, so it had probably had a very boring, very lonely day. Which is why it was important to inform it of the news. Though he might leave the bit about the two sisters he had rescued for when they appeared, that certainly would get him forgiven for disappearing for most of the day. Raising his hand, he waved farewell to the two. Right? I might see you both later. And if I don't, I will see you tomorrow morning for Baka-sensei's test. Bye! He barely made it to the lip of the roof before Sakura called out to him once more. Naruto, wait up. I'll come with you, we just need to stop by mine, so that I can tell my parents that I am eating out tonight and not to wait for me. That wasn't the worst thing in the world, Naruto supposed. Sakura's was pretty much on the way to his, so it wouldn't be much of a delay. Turning to Sasuke, he spoke quickly, just so that when he started again he wouldn't have to stop once more. You going to come along, team? The boy seemed to war with himself for a moment before finally shaking his head. I bet you can't have done anything that interesting to be worth wasting my evening training. See you tomorrow, Dobe. Well, at least he could say that he had tried if anyone asked where the third member of his team was. Shrugging to himself, he turned back to Sakura and grinned lightly at her. One of the things that his clones discovered whilst watching all the various girls was that they really disliked boys that tried too hard, as he had done with Sakura previously in the academy. As such, he toned it down as best he could, speaking normally rather than shouting as he felt prone to doing at times. Well, I did my best, Sakura-chan. I'm afraid it's just us and the other girls, though I'm sure that you will get along with them just fine. Sakura smiled, obviously pleased that he hadn't tried to claim that this was a date or something similar. They leapt off in the direction of Sakura's, and it was actually Sakura that spoke first as they traveled off together. So Naruto, how exactly is it that you know where I live? I saw you jump off first, so you can't claim you were following me. He knew that his clones would land him in trouble sooner or later. Now he had to think of an excuse very quickly to save himself a beating. They reached his apartment thankfully without him gaining even more bruises than he already had on him. He had remembered just in time that when they were younger he had walked her home from the academy, only to ruin it by doing something stupid that had left Sakura fuming on her doorstep as he ran for his life. Recalling the occasion out loud, it had mollified Sakura sufficiently that she dropped the conversation without further comment, the two continuing to Sakura's house in companionable silence. Naruto had waited on the rooftops while Sakura had entered her house, preferring to avoid the confrontation that was bound to happen if he showed his face around Sakura's house again whilst her parents were around. Once Sakura had reappeared, they had continued to the slums where Naruto lived, Sakura obviously being surprised that Naruto lived in such an area, but thankfully refraining from commenting on it to him. that brought them to where they were now, knocking on the door that Umei had selected that she wanted to live in, a floor above Naruto's but in the middle of the set of flats, just like Naruto's was. After a few seconds the door opened and Umei appeared, looking a little flustered and dust-covered, but otherwise happy. That changed when she saw Naruto, swinging open the door and rushing towards him. "Naruto-san, what happened to you? You look like you were attacked by a tiger." Naruto chuckled embarrassed as he batted her hands away from him. "It's fine, Umi-chan. I will tell you over dinner. Oh, by the way, Sakura-chan, this is Umi-chan, savior of my poor hide and a friend as of yesterday. Umi-chan, meet Sakura, my teammate subject to us passing our test tomorrow, of course." Umei giggled at his over-the-top introduction, while Sakura merely shook her head and smiled at him before asking a question. "You only met yesterday? You two seem fast friends for such a short period. How did you both meet? Did Naruto get you with that childish prank of his or something?" And thus the three of them spent the rest of the trip to Ichikaris recounting the tale of Umei's tumultuous arrival in Konoha and Naruto's involvement in it all. Sakura listened attentively, gasping at the description of the bandit attack and giggling at the description of Naruto's taunting of the Chunin. She cast a surprised look at Naruto when Umei described how he had been keeping an eye on her and rescued her wallet from the pickpocket. "I'm impressed, Naruto, with how you've always acted. I assumed you were a bit careless about things. But you actually showed a surprising amount of thought for your actions there." Naruto chuckled embarrassedly once more. How incorrect that idea was. "Not really, Sakura-chan. In fact, if not for Umi-chan's generosity here, I would currently be on the streets, which is why technically until I pay her back her money, she's technically my landlord." Before Sakura could ask for clarification on what he meant about any of that, they were interrupted by two blurs of motion that slammed into Naruto, almost knocking him off his feet. He had just managed to brace himself, however, and after rocking for a moment, he hugged the two girls that had jumped him. "Ako-chan, Yuna-chan, don't do that. If I hadn't seen you coming, we could all have gone flying and my bruises would get even bigger than they are now." The two girls, 2 years younger than Naruto, giggled at this before stepping back and attempting to look contrite. "Sorry, Naruto-kun. We were just so happy to see you. The scary lady you left us with wasn't much fun, and the blonde guy made our heads feel funny." Naruto now understood what the purple-haired lady had meant when she had said that the two would be okay by the time he saw them again. The blonde man had obviously been a Yamanaka and as such had probably removed the memories of Akko's almost rape, and just left the ones of Naruto rescuing them from captivity. Just as Naruto was about to apologize, Umei called out in shock, "Akko, Yuna? But how?" She was looking between the two girls and Naruto for an exclamation even as the two girls recognized her and ran over to her to hug her as well. Sakura was obviously the most confused and was rather vocal about it. "Naruto, I think we all need an explanation now, and I imagine that it is going to take a while. Is this the place you were meaning for food?" she said, pointing at Ichikaris in front of them, where the two girls had just come from. Naruto nodded and smiled at all of them. "Indeed it is, and as I have obviously confused you all, it's on me whilst I explain. Now let's eat." 40 minutes later, he had gathered a small crowd, including some of the stand's regulars, Ayam and the other 4 girls, and even 1 or 2 people from the street as he told the tale of how he had been tricked by Mizuki into stealing the Forbidden Scroll, and how he and Irika had fought him afterwards to stop him killing them and stealing the Forbidden Scroll for whatever nefarious purpose. There had been gasps, laughs, and shocked silences as he had told his tale, doing his utmost to ensure he was keeping it honest. Apart from the bit about the fox and him being its container, of course, that was left out as he really didn't want Sakura to know about it. Instead, he painted the picture that Mizuki had used him all year long, making sure he failed enough to ensure he did not succeed the final exam, before using him as a scapegoat to pin the theft on. He had been smacked by Umei, Ayam, and Sakura when they heard he used his sexy no jutsu to knock out the Hokage, but they still were giggling at the thought, so he didn't mind too much. When he finished the tale, with him using Kagebushin to beat Mizuki to a pulp, there was applause and 1 or 2 appreciative cheers from the crowd, which he of course could not resist bowing to, only to tip out of his chair by overextending to raucous laughter. Standing once more, there was a call from somewhere near the back. One more, I say." There were calls of agreement from the crowd, as well as calls for more ramen and drinks. Whilst Ayam rushed her way round the group taking the multitude of orders, Naruto raised his hands, beckoning for silence once more. Okay, you guys do ask for a lot, but what can I say? I'm a crowd pleaser. In which case, let me tell you the tale of today, and how I came to meet these 2 little damsels here, and how I ended up looking like as much of a mess as I do now. He finished by reaching across and ruffling the girl's hair, causing both to complain playfully and squirm in their seats, trying to get away from his hands. Settling back in his seat and stirring his now stone-cold ramen, he began by telling of the build-up to the day, introducing Umei to everyone and how she came to be in Konoha. By the time he finished his description of the bandit attack, he once more had everyone's attention. The only movements were their consumption of their ramen and drinks before silently beckoning for more from the very busy Ichikaras. He then skipped to when he and Himako had left the gates the next morning, only to be shouted into continuing the whole tale by the crowd. Therefore, for the next hour he unfolded the tale of the last 2 days. He spoke of his prank, getting good-natured jeers and calls from the crowd who had been on the wrong end of the prank, as they now understood why he had needed to blow off some steam after the incident with Mizuki. His description of his meeting with the Hokage stopped those soon enough, and the silence was maintained as he described tracking the pickpocket down and retrieving Umei's money. Umei's generosity restored the cheerier mood, and his meeting with Himako brought rounds of laughs, mostly at his expense, of course. There was quiet murmurings when he described his failed attempts at finding out where the bandits had gone, which turned into excited whispering as he described finding the ruse and how the bandits had done their little plan. The whispering turned angry as Naruto described finding the bodies in their pile, and he had to gesture for quiet once more. He described finding the camp, and that Akko had fought against one of the bandits, and how he had then jumped in order to save her life, to the gasps of the crowd around him. He cast his mind back to the fight. After all, if he was going to describe how he almost died more times than he could count, he wanted to make sure he told the tale accurately. Flashback. The bandits got over their shock quite quickly, especially as the axe-wielding clones threw themselves forward to engage as many of the bandits as possible. With the battle beginning in earnest around him, Naruto created another 24 clones, the toll on his stamina beginning to tell as sweat appeared on his brow. He quickly gave his orders to those around him. "You lot, your sole job is to get every captive out of here. I will distract them. Once that is done, find where Himako is, and tell her to wait for my signal. She will be very useful as a surprise piece here, just in case they pull something unexpected on us." No cheers, no signs of agreement. The clones were just gone into the melee like they had never been there, though he noticed that the girl was gone from where she had been as well, so he knew they hadn't just been dispersed. There was a shout from behind him, and he turned, raising the axe defensively as he did so. It was lucky that he did so, as the axe blade intercepted the blade thrust from a bandit armed with a rapier, who seemed to have worked through his clones with relative ease. The blade slipped up the axe's blade and towards his face, opening a cut on Naruto's brow even as he ducked back to avoid it. The two clashed again, the bandit's skill and strength against Naruto's reflexes and speed, and the bandit seemed to be winning. Deciding to act like a ninja, Naruto waited until the bandit was striking once more, before replacing himself with an unwitting bandit who he could see fighting just behind the rapier bandit. The bandits had no time to react before the rapier pierced the replaced bandit's stomach for almost 3 inches before the other bandit managed to stop himself and his blade. The bandit realized the ruse and withdrew his blade whilst turning around, but it was too late, the side of Naruto's axe slamming into his face with a crunch, blood pouring from his nose as he fell unconscious, the other bandit taken down by a clone from behind. Having incapacitated the 2 bandits, Naruto grabbed the rapier from the floor where the bandit had dropped it, before casting his gaze round. The battle was not going well for him and his clones, not that he had really expected it to. There were only a third of his clones left now, and they only seemed to have dropped 20 or so bandits, through trickery or other means. Deciding that if it weren't broke, don't fix it, he summoned another 60 clones, who faced the previously victorious bandits with the original at their head. Raising the rapier above his head, having stowed the axe at his waist, he shouted out a single word: "Charge!" With this, the clones shot forward, catapulted by Naruto's chakra technique, slamming into the surprised bandits with devastating force. The original ducked and weaved through the conflict, targeting those bandits that seemed the most adept at taking out his clones. First was a giant of a man, whose 2-handed hammer was the bane of the clones that were not able to dodge due to surprise or the roiling melee around them. Naruto worked by ducking and dodging through the strikes until he was too close to the man for him to use his weapon, distracting him long enough for a trio of clones to strike him down from the back, though the man had caught him full in the face with one of his massive hands as he did so, causing his left eyelid to swell up within minutes. With his vision partially impaired, Naruto was forced into his next battle with no respite, faced by a scarred man with an eye patch and armed with a deadly pair of knives. The man soon proved to be superior in terms of weapon skill compared to Naruto, but didn't expect for Naruto, having dived backwards to avoid another set of cuts, several of which covered his torso already from this man, to pick up dirt from the floor with his spare hand, and then promptly throw it into the man's only eye during the next exchange between the two, followed by two haymakers that had the man on the floor unconscious like many of the other bandits around him. With the addition of the second set of clones, the battle had turned in the favor of Naruto and his clones once more than half the bandits having been taken down and several of the more skilled bandits amongst them. Then there was an explosion, and almost a dozen of his clones burst into smoke. A moment later 6 more burst into smoke whilst 3 more blocked the flying weapons that were revealed to be shuriken. Appearing through the smoke generated by his clones' dispersal was a man. He was in his mid-30s, average size and build with one ugly scar down the left-hand side of his face and armed with a multitude of knives and shurikens strapped to his chest, arms, and upper legs. The man eyed Naruto up and down before laughing in an uproarious manner. "You guys are struggling against this guy? The boss sent me to see what the commotion was, thinking you guys were being attacked by a tiger or something, and here I find you struggling against a shrimp and his duplicates. I can tell you now he will not be happy at all with this." One of the remaining bandits raised his hands defensively. "But Socho, we were taken by surprise. There were so many of Theurg." He finished with a gurgle as one of the man's knives implanted itself in his neck. "Anyone else want to try and make excuses? Good, now keep the clones busy. I will deal with the kid and end this. We then have to move out in case he called for reinforcements. One of you inform the boss now, or it will be all of our heads." With that, the man charged, reducing the clones that tried to intercept him with swift deadly strikes, Naruto barely reacting in time to avoid a stab to the gut, instead receiving a deep cut in his left side. Shrugging off the pain as best he could, he struck back out with the rapier, only for the man to disarm him with surprising ease. The man chuckled, "You really are new at this, aren't you, kid? At least make it somewhat of a challenge to kill you. If you are interesting enough, I will add your headband to my collection." He opened his jacket to show at least 6 headbands strapped to his chest, all of them Konoha ones. With this revelation, Naruto saw red. Drawing the axe, he poured chakra into his feet before shooting forward. The surprised look on the man's face was very gratifying even as Naruto shattered one of the man's weapons and continued to drive forward. His progress was stopped when his axe blade dug into one of the forehead protectors and stopped there, before being booted away with a swift kick that left him gasping for air. The man drew another blade after throwing away the hilt of the broken one and eyed Naruto appreciatively this time, fingering the cut with one hand. "That's some move you have there, kid, unlucky with the forehead protector, but that is why I put them there, of course. Now, unless you have something else to match me, it's right about time you died. No bad feelings, of course, just business." The man charged him and Naruto was forced on the defensive, and even then the man was opening wound after wound on his torso and arms, slowing him down even further. As a last-ditch attempt to turn the battle around, Naruto summoned his chakra, creating several clones between him and the bandit. They lasted barely a second, and the bandit then reached through the smoke and grabbed Naruto's neck, batting the axe away as Naruto tried to swing it at him, before grinning down at Naruto, who was struggling weakly against his grip. "Good try, but I was expecting it. Any last words, brat?" Naruto tried to say something, blood oozing from his mouth as he did so, but it came out as an intelligible murmur. The bandit leaned in closer, grinning wickedly. "Sorry, brat, want to repeat that?" This time, Naruto grinned back, uttering 2 words to the surprised bandit. "Decoy, bitch!" And then it turned to smoke, the bandit only having time to roar in anger before Naruto burst from where he had been transformed as the clone's axe, burying the blade of his own axe into the man's unprotected back. Falling forwards, the bandit uttered one sentence before he breathed his last. His voice quiet but audible to Naruto all the same. "Well played, kid. But now you got to beat the boss." As if heralding the arrival of the man, Naruto had no time to react before he was smashed in the stomach by a mace, blood exploding from his mouth. Landing in a heap, he looked up to find a large red-haired man stood over snarling at him, crude mace in one hand that was easily half the size of Naruto. Just as the man raised his mace once more, snakes flew through the air and slammed into the bandit, pushing him back as he beat them away with his mace and hands. Struggling to his feet, stars bursting in his vision, he felt someone land next to him and he groggily turned, hands raised defensively, only to find a purple-haired lady with fishnet clothes and a forehead protector around her neck that signified she was from Konoha. She was looking at him with a smirk, as best as he could tell with his limited vision anyways. "You look like hell, kid. But good job nonetheless, we will take it from here, you have a rest." Naruto saluted lazily, before tilting forwards unconscious, into the lady's bust without a care in the world. End flashback. Even as he finished his story, he held up his hands defensively as he could see Ayam and Sakura were looking at him dangerously. "Don't hurt me, I was unconscious well before I fell forwards, so I didn't do it on purpose, I swear it's true." It seemed to mollify them as the rest of the group burst into applause, several of the men wolf whistling as well, bringing a blush to his face as he tried to act modest in front of all the attention. Slowly the crowd dispersed, realizing that there was no more to come, and he was left with his friends once more. Umei, Akko and Yuno were looking at him with awe, and even Sakura was looking very impressed with his work. But before they could say anything else, there was a very cross voice from the door, and when Naruto turned he found himself faced by two Tentens, one looking very angry whilst the other was cringing and looking apologetically at Naruto. "Perhaps you have time now you have finished telling tales, to tell me exactly why one of your clones is currently pretending to be me and asking my sensei about his eternal rival?" With a flick of her wrist, she dispelled the quivering clone even as Naruto gulped apprehensively. Well, it's all like this really. If he survived the next encounter, he knew he owed Cammy quite the amount of good karma to pay all of this good luck that he had been receiving recently off of her. Chapter 11, The Last of the Night's Affairs. And with us knowing nothing about Kakashi's test tomorrow, or about the test tomorrow, I decided to do a bit of investigating. You popped into my head as I knew you graduated last year and thus had a genin team in Sensei. My clone obviously thought that your team might know something about what we were to expect. That's all I was doing, and I'm very sorry and won't do it again. Don't hit me please. I have far too many bruises and cuts already without you adding any more. Looking up between his defensively placed hands after his impassioned plea, he found himself looking at Tenten, who was smirking down at him, the other girls looking at him with a grin. Well, at least you know how to apologize for making my next few weeks absolute hell, which it most definitely going to be now. He thinks that I am interested in getting an eternal rival like he likes to keep going on about. Now, buy me some ramen and promise to help me train some time, and I might forgive you in time. What do you say? Naruto sighed. It could be worse, he supposed. At least it was only dinner, though the other request. Train with you? Why would you want me to train with you? I've only just graduated. She looked at him like he was stupid. You can create solid clones, and if your story is true you can create loads of them. That's the best targets I can ever have for throwing practice. That made some sense, he supposed, and he acquiesced with a downhearted sigh and turned to Ayam. You can add Tenten's meal to my bill as well as the others. The only good news is that I get the bounties for all the bandits I defeated tomorrow, even if I didn't get paid for the mission itself. I'm just hoping that Gigi has been keeping track of how much money and time this counts as in regards to my prank fine, as I really haven't had time to care since yesterday. They sat down and ate, the girls chatting amongst themselves whilst Naruto inhaled his ramen as quickly as he could. He managed to reach 7 bowls before Ayam forced him to slow down, as Akko was trying to copy his mannerisms, or the complete lack of them as the case was when he got into one of his ramen sprees. With the added incentive of someone trying to copy him on something for the first time, he remembered his manners as best he could. Even though it slowed him considerably, it was worth it. It was 8 o'clock when Sakura put down her 3rd ramen bowl with a contented sigh. Right, I have to be off home now. Chores to do, and I want to be up early tomorrow for Kakashi's test. Thank you very much for an interesting evening, Naruto. I will cover my part of the bill as you sound like you will be short of funds for the near future. And besides, you did very well this evening. You didn't even try and call it a date or anything. She smiled even as I pouted. Sakura-chan. She and Umei giggled at the response. I am bringing her change before she waved goodbye to everyone before leaping off to the rooftops. I am looked at him with a wicked smile. She seemed nice enough. Should I be worried about you ignoring your promise to me that you made all those years ago? You seem to be gathering quite the group of girls together. Naruto winced. He had forgotten that particular promise. Ayam-chan, I was like 5 when I made that promise. I didn't think you would take it seriously. I mean, I'm sure you would prefer someone else by now rather than me, even if I do make it to be Hokage. The incident in question had happened on the first night Naruto had discovered the little ramen stand, and Ayam had giggled at his shyness as he slowly edged his way in looking absolutely terrified, grabbing his hand and bringing him to the bar with a huge smile on her face. Her dad was busy cooking for the other customers they had, so she took Naruto's hesitant order of a miso ramen, and having been learning how to make ramen from her dad, had made the bowl for him herself. Whilst she had since made much better ramen for him, at the time it had been the nicest thing he had ever tasted, declaring as much to Ayam, who had blushed before stating that it wasn't as good as her dad's. He had told her he didn't care and that if she would cook this well for him, when he was Hokage he would marry her so that only he would be able to have her ramen. He had no real idea about marriage at that point, only that it seemed to make most people really happy, even when they were really old. Ayam had known more, being older and having been a much better student at school, and had blushed before asking if he was serious. He had affirmed that he was, going so far as to pinky promise with her about the matter, to the gruff laughter of her father who had been listening in. He was brought forth from his reminiscing by a thwack to the side of the head, Ayam glaring at him. I did only mean it as a joke, Naruto, though I advise you not to assume you know about what a woman wants. It will not end well for you. He nodded meekly. Hi Ayam-chan, I won't do it again. She smiled and all was well in the world again. Tenten spoke after it was clear the two had finished. Right, well I am going now, thanks for the meal Naruto-san, and I expect you tomorrow evening for training. I'm sure you can find my team then, you seem quite adept at doing so. After receiving a chorus of farewells, she too left the stand, and Naruto decided that now was probably as good a time as any to settle the bill, as everyone had finished eating. Tucci had shaken his head when Naruto had asked for the bill, instead opening the till that the Ichikaras used for their money, pulling out a few 50 Ryo notes and waving them at Naruto. I don't think you noticed, Naruto, but with your stories keeping people eating and drinking, this was the most successful night that I have had in almost 20 years. We made almost 1,000 Ryo profit, and if you had continued, I may well have run out of ramen stock. So I would like to offer you a deal. Every time you come and tell of your adventures and they gather a crowd, I will give you a third of the takings that we make more than normal, minus the cost of anything you order. With your friend's food, I count it at 150 Ryo for the night, which isn't a bad little sum. Naruto waved his hands dismissively. You know I can't accept that, Gigi. That's your money you earned with your awesome cooking. You can't expect me to take it for simply telling my friends a story. Tucci grinned even as Naruto felt a pair of feminine hands entwine lightly but firmly around his neck from behind him, and Ayam's voice spoke softly in his ear. But Naruto-kun, if you don't start earning money soon, how will you ever pay Umi-chan back? I don't want my future husband to be in debt before he marries me. How will you buy me lots of pretty things if you have no money? Whilst there was a teasing tone in Ayam's voice, he could also tell that if he continued to refuse the money she would make him regret it very, very much. With the countenance of a man on his way to the chopping block, he spoke, Well, Gigi, you sure know how to use your beautiful daughter to win your arguments for you. I accept the job offer, though I'm not promising any more tales for some time. I don't know whether we will get anything interesting in the near future. After losing that argument, the evening had ended shortly afterwards, with Akko and Yuna yawning loudly and wishing for bed. After telling them that he had a place for them to stay, which meant he had to survive another attempt at knocking him to the floor as the two younger girls hugged him happily before going and hugging Umei, who told the two that she was also living in the same place, Naruto said goodbye to the Ichikaras and thanked them once more for their support and excellent food. He was surprised when Ayam shook her head at him before stepping up to him and embracing him in a hug, thanking him for a nice evening. She then pulled back and grinned wickedly before stating that she looked forward to him starting on his promise soon, as she wanted at least a dozen dates before the engagement began. That comment left Naruto red-faced but grinning as he shouted back that to do so might annoy her father, but he would be in touch. He had walked the girls home, ushering Akko and Yuna into the apartment next to Umei's that he had had clones clear out and prepare whilst they had been having ramen. He promised to help them decorate it as they liked the next day, as well as giving Yuna a spare key for his room, in case they needed him for whatever reason. With the two young ones in bed, Umei and Naruto had gone into Umei's apartment, and whilst Naruto had slowly replenished the clone's chakra, which had been running dangerously low by this point, the two had discussed what had happened over the last day that Umei may have missed. After his case with Yugao and the girl spy, Naruto kept it serious, and Umei obviously got the hint as the two talked as they would in public, saying nothing that might reveal themselves as the same person. Once the talking was done and the clone recharged, Naruto had bid her good night on her doorstep, only to be surprised by the hug that he received from Umei, who then pulled back and smiled tearfully at him. I was so worried when I opened this door and you were stood there like you were. Please don't do that again. I don't think I could take it. Naruto did his best to reassure her with a smile. Don't worry about me, Umi-chan. I will always be here. I have to make it to Hokage, don't I? She giggled and let him go without further comment, but he had to admit that the clone was really acting the part well now, obviously had worked very hard to align himself with the role he had created. Closing the door, Naruto didn't even jump this time as a voice came from behind him, getting annoyingly used to people appearing unannounced into his home. Turning, he found himself facing the purple-haired woman that had saved him earlier today, her face unreadable. You know, I should be angry with you for the whole revealing the bus thing you did. But I feel you are in enough trouble without having me on your case. He grimaced, walking up to her as she stood next to his kitchen counter and bowing respectfully. You were listening as well? You could have come and joined us, I'm sure. Sorry, I do not know your name, Kanochi-san. The woman smirked and leaned against the counter, and after a moment of pondering, Naruto joined her nervously. No sweat, you're not old enough to have heard of me yet, I imagine. I am Anko Mitarashi, member of the Torture and Interrogation Department, who the survivors of the attack today were taken to. Though I doubt we will get anything from them, minions like that aren't told anything by their masters. Feeling a little relieved by the fact the woman wasn't mad at him for anything, Naruto relaxed into the sofa, smile leaving his face and his face becoming sadder. Okay then, Anko-san, no offense, but what are doing here? If you need a full report, I can write you one for the morning, but I would really prefer to be alone for the night. That got rid of the teasing smirk that had been seemingly fixed on her countenance, her face becoming serious as she sat forward, eyes fixed on him. Surprisingly enough, kid, when our ninja make their first kills, we like to look after them. What you have been through today is more than can be expected from any of our graduates, and I am here as the current expert in psychology, albeit off duty right now. What I am saying, I suppose, is that I am here to give you any help you need with dealing with death and your role in it. Naruto scoffed darkly. Obviously, the Hokage had been telling the truth all those years ago. Thanks, Anko-san, but this isn't my first kill after my childhood. It should not be surprising that I have already had to defend my life and take another one's. He could tell that shocked her, and she actually grabbed his arm lightly as she leaned closer to look at his face. How old were you? Does the Hokage know? Did you get any counseling? Once more he shrugged, eyes darkening as he recalled the event to her. Clear as crystal even after all these years. I was 5 years old, it was my birthday. A drunkard broke into my flat that I had just been given by the Hokage, and set about me with a knife, screaming at me that I would pay for killing his brother. I was terrified, and when the man dropped the knife after stabbing me twice, I grabbed it and held it defensively in front of me, backing away from the man, one hand on the knife, the other reaching for my door handle when he rushed towards me drawing another knife. Without thinking, I thrust the blade forward, hoping to make him back off. But he had been too drunk to care and instead had thrust himself on my blade. He didn't die quickly, and it was not fun to watch even as my guards eventually got their acts together and called the Hokage to the scene. He quieted the event from public view and left it at that. Only Ino's dad knew, as well as he was the one that I needed to see about the trauma. He looked down at his hands, before shuddering and looking away from them, and I thought that it would become easier the next time it happened. Anko's face softened somewhat, and she moved to grab his shoulder and drag him to the couch. Sitting the two of them down upon it, close to each other but not touching, she smiled reassuringly and leant back relaxingly. Come on then, kid. I think we need to have a chat about this, or whatever the hell you like to chat about. And thus, Naruto slowly began to speak about the fight when he was younger, the hate of the villagers and how it made him feel even now, and before he knew it, he was revealing things that he had never told anyone before, the times he had considered attacking those that had ignored and glared at him, just so that they would not do so again without thinking about the consequences first. The times he had contemplated running away from the village, having heard the wonderful tales of the Fire Country capital and hoping he would be accepted there. And before he had realized it, he was falling asleep, completely unaware that he was doing so. Persona change. Anko Mitarashi, Special Jounin of Konoha. Watching the kid drop off to sleep, Anko was struggling to suppress her emotions and to maintain her facade. The psychological persona that she used when her more physical methods of extracting information was considered too extreme or inappropriate for the target. It evidently had worked, however. The kid had told her a lot that had not been known about his psyche. If it weren't for the two facts that firstly he seemed to have stabilized himself on the psychological front, and more importantly she thought that him being a ninja would reduce the chance of him running out of the country, she would have been forced to report him to the Hokage and have him removed from active duty before he had even begun participating in official missions. Terrifying, isn't it? The psyche of one of the most powerful entities of the planet. So fragile, and yet no one knows the truth. Even those that know of the lie only know some of the truth. Anko was on her feet in a moment at the noise, and her paranoia ramped up when a moment later a cloaked girl appeared out of the shadows. Even as Anko raised her hands for her kunai pouch, the girl held up her hands. "Peace, Anko-san. I am not here to fight, and besides, do you truly believe that you can truly do better than the ANBU squads last night? Especially with someone you need to protect as well." The girl gestured to the sleeping container and Anko felt her blood run cold even as the girl continued. "So you understand your position? Good. That reduces the chance of you trying to do something foolish during our conversation." Anko was confused. This was the girl who had been hunted through Konoha. Every ninja above Chunin had been informed in case they were on duty if she was spotted again. Yet here she was in the Gaki's lounge as if it were the most normal thing in the world. In an attempt to glean some information, Anko gestured at Naruto with one hand. "What do you want with the Gaki? You know that should you try and take him you wouldn't make it out of the village." That was true enough. Anko would at least be able to raise a form of alert before the girl would be able to effect an escape. And once it was clear the container was gone, the village would be put on lockdown that nobody would be able to escape until he was found once more. The girl scoffed as if Anko had just insulted her. "The boy is no interest of mine to kidnap, simply a valuable target that should make even the Hokage take me seriously with what I have to say to you, and what you will tell him, as the man obviously likes the boy, so the threat of removing him will be countered effectively, or that is the hope." Now Anko made no subtlety in her motions towards her kunai pouch, and the girl stiffened in response, hand going to her katana hilt. Both Kunoichi stood off for a moment longer before the masked girl relaxed once more. "Calm yourself. Naruto is simply an insurance policy for this meeting to go as planned. He will not come to harm as long as you do not attack me or try to alert anyone else. Now, I have information that will be of use to you, if you will allow me to tell it." Now Anko was really suspicious, but decided not to be hasty and would allow the girl to at least say her piece. "Well, you hardly give me any other choice. So tell me quickly so that we can get this conversation with." The girl nodded very well. "I am here to tell you that someone is going to infiltrate the village, if they haven't already, and that they will be planning a level of sabotage by the end of the year which will damage Konoha greatly." Anko looked confused. This wasn't exactly what she had expected. "Why are you telling me this information? What do you gain from this?" The girl shrugged carelessly before turning away from Anko to look at the sleeping Naruto. "My reasons are my own, my rewards are mine to know, but I suppose you can know that while spying on Naruto-san, my feelings towards this village and its inhabitants have changed. I mean, if he can withstand such hate without breaking down and destroying this place, perhaps there is something about it that is worth saving, for his sake at least." Anko smirked even as the girl realized that she might have said too much and backed away a couple of steps. "You just lost your biggest bargaining chip with admitting your feelings there, but I suppose if you are genuine about them you are also genuine about the warning, so I will let you go for now, as I doubt I could stop you anyways." The girl didn't respond, and in a poof of smoke laced with lightning she was gone in a shushin, leaving Anko alone. Looking across at the sleeping boy, she couldn't stop the chuckle that came to her a moment later. "Oh Gaki, can't leave you alone for a minute, can we?" And then she was gone, off to notify her leader of the latest threat to present itself towards the young container, and to assess the warning that she had just been given in its entirety. Persona: Na Agent 371. She bowed her head as she entered Danzo's study once more as a sign of respect, and he looked up with a small smile, obviously amused by something in the situation they were in, though before she could figure out what it was he spoke to her with almost a slight teasing tone to his voice. "Well, Agent, you seem to be making this a habit of breaking contact with your target earlier than you are meant to. What is your reason for doing so this time?" She failed to understand why that pattern would be amusing to him, but it was not for her to question his humor, and as such she replied hastily, hoping he would approve of her latest change in their plan. "I am here to inform you of an opportunity that appeared this evening after Naruto returned from his mission." She paused to check that he knew of what she was talking about, and surprisingly his grin was still present as he spoke to confirm his knowledge. I know about what happened today, very impressive work, even if it was only fluke that he stumbled upon the trail as he did. And it is Naruto now? You aren't getting too attached to the boy, are you? She froze, not having even realized that she had used the target's actual name in such a familiar manner, though she now realized why Danzo was still smiling in the manner of a tiger that had his prey stuck right where he wanted them. She managed to think up of a logical deflection that might help her, however, and spoke normally in an attempt to hide her discomfort. Apologies, Danzo-sama. As part of the opportunity that I mentioned before, I had to take on a persona of someone who cares for the target, and I have not yet truly dropped the facade. He seemed to consider this for a moment before nodding and gesturing for her to continue, withholding judgment until he knew more. I was observing the targets on his return, and once he returned to his apartment, Anko Mitarashi was waiting for him, having been uninformed of his previous assault and managed to wrangle quite the few secrets out of the target due to his exhaustion and her own skills at psychology. There was the risk that she could want to take him off active service and have him properly interviewed by a Yamanaka, which would have revealed the ploy that we have been trying to hide. Therefore, I took a logical gamble and revealed myself to her. That caused Danzo to lose his smile, and he sat up seriously. Though he did not speak, instead he merely waited, though the gleam in his eye showed her that her reasoning for the situation had better be sound. My reasons for doing so were twofold. Firstly, it was to inform them that there would be an infiltration attempt against Konoha that would prove very damaging to them. This, combined with my accidental slip of somewhat caring for the container, will make them think that he is the infiltrator's target, and they will tighten security around him, despite how useless that will be, as they will not think to investigate Umei at all. It also increases his chances of becoming a successful genin this year, as the Hokage will probably tell the jounin in charge of his squad to pass his team, so that he can be watched by them during the daylight hours. My second reason was that it allowed me to further separate myself from any idea that I am a member of the organization, which will further throw off any ideas they have of my intentions in the village. Danzo didn't say anything for a few moments, and she felt the slightest pang of something she identified as worry that he thought that she had done the wrong thing. After another moment, however, he leaned back and shrugged. I suppose it is a sound decision, though it does make our next move quite difficult in regards to the boy, as watching him and his project will become almost impossible now that Sarutobi has truly been made paranoid about his safety. She looked up, and the slightest sense of relief washed over her before she brushed it off and broached her next slightly risky idea. Perhaps, Danzo-sama, the way around this problem is to be a little less covert about the situation. The target is a friendly and attention-seeking boy who loves to make more friends with people. So perhaps the solution is that I befriend him in my official role rather than spy on him during my off time for missions. He looked her in the eye for a moment, face set in stone, before he posed his reply to her. Are you sure that you have considered this properly? You would be exposing your cover, and I would be forced to place the seal on you for the security of Root. She nodded. The risks were present, but she was sure she could avoid exposure. It was not like anyone would know that she was spying on the container once she found a way to make contact with him in a believable and non-suspicious manner. Hi, Danzo-sama. I know what I am asking for, and I understand the risks. Besides, I think I am in need of reinforcing my public persona somewhat anyways. With this step up in scrutiny, I might fall under suspicion if I am as antisocial as I am currently being. He nodded, accepting her decision, and stood slowly, walking round his desk. Come then, we will apply the seal now, and then you can be on your way. Just make sure that you remember that your mission is to keep the target safe. Not to get too close to Naruto the container, though I am sure you wouldn't mind that either. It was a good job she was wearing her mask, as she was blushing slightly at the insinuation he had just thrown at her, and him seeing that would do her no good whatsoever. Chapter 12: The Test. Persona: Naruto Uzumaki. Naruto woke the next day with a headache and a sore neck despite having one of the best nights of sleep that he had had in years, and once he woke himself to a decent level, he remembered why Anko's actions of the night before causing him to curse even as he got up to turn his alarm off that had been the thing to awaken him. Looking at the time on the clock, he panicked and rushed to go and get some clothes on. He was almost half an hour late. 20 minutes later, he landed in Training Ground 7 with a heavy thud, having used his clones to throw him through the air high above Konoha, as it was quicker than trying to navigate the streets or rooftops at this time in the morning. Standing from his crouch and dusting himself off, he looked up to find a shocked Sakura and a mildly interested Sasuke looking at him. As with the previous day, it was Sakura who found her voice and asked in obvious wonderment, "Naruto, did you just fly here? And how are you all recovered from yesterday?" He resisted the urge to chuckle at her first question, though he supposed that might be what it had looked like from this end, though the second query quickly brought him back to reality and he had to think on his feet to come up with an answer. Well, Sakura-chan, I have just come from being debriefed about yesterday, and whilst I was there a medic Neen fixed me up as best she could. Still a little sore though. About the transportation, if you want to call it flying, you're welcome to, but it's actually me using my clones again to jump off gives me a nice boost to speed. He then looked around and for the first time noticed the lack of his silver-haired Jounin-sensei. Ano, where is Kakashi-sensei? Or is he being late again? Sakura seemed to consider her response for a moment before sighing and sitting down once more. Sensei isn't here yet, Naruto. I hope he doesn't plan on making this a habit, especially if he keeps telling us the wrong time to turn up. Sasuke grunted, obviously in agreement with what Sakura had said, causing the girl to go a little dreamy-eyed at the notion that her crush thought she was right. Though before he could get upset at the interaction, Kakashi appeared in a poof of smoke not too far from where they were stood, his mask covering up his facial expressions even as the man turned and eyed them for a moment critically, before raising his hand and waving as the visible part of his face crinkled into what could be interpreted as a smile. Morning, little ones. Naruto wisely stepped to the side. He had seen that look on Sakura's face before, though thankfully it was directed at someone other than him for a change. Breathing in deeply, she let loose with a single yell that embodied all of her annoyance and dislike for having been made to wait for the man in front of her. You're late. Kakashi actually looked surprised at the sheer force of will behind the shout that was leveled in his direction from someone who hadn't even been taught in the art of intent projection yet. But he was a seasoned ninja who had faced far worse in his time, and as such quickly schooled his features back to his original carefree expression as he replied. Mao Mao, you are quite the vocal one, aren't you? Well, I was late because on my way here, I happened across an old lady who was having difficulty with her shopping. It was at this point that Naruto remembered the memories that he had got from the clones the night before. Nobody had been able to tell him what the test was, as he wasn't really able to just go out and ask about it in his disguises as that would have been suspicious, but they had been able to tell him quite a bit about the man himself. That included his most well-known habits of being a pervert and also being late to everything, and giving really bad excuses when questioned upon it, and feeling that this was the case here, he chose to interrupt rather than waste any more time. Kakashi-sensei, I think we all know that's not what happened, and that you're not going to tell us what really did happen anytime soon. So, can you just save us all some time and tell us what the test is? Considering your history, I would quite like to be the first to pass this test. Kakashi paused, obviously surprised that Naruto had interrupted him and had also known information about the test, as unimportant as it was towards the test itself. And how would you know that little tidbit, Naruto? Unless you happen to be the cause of my sudden popularity increase in the gossip circles around Konoha last night. Naruto chuckled slightly nervously to himself. Obviously he hadn't been as subtle as he had initially thought with his information gathering, though of course that many people suddenly asking about the same thing would lead to someone noticing at some point. However, just because he had been called on it didn't mean he was just going to out and admit it directly. I have no idea what you're talking about, Kakashi-sensei. I mean, people are bound to talk about you at some point. After all, you are considered one of the most powerful jounin in Konoha, especially with your moniker, the Copy-nin of Konoha. That truly grabbed the attention of both Sakura and Sasuke in addition to the man he was actually talking to now, if Sasuke's intense gaze and smirk were anything to go by anyways. With the undivided attention of the entire group, he couldn't resist the chance to throw in one last piece of information that he had managed to gather from the records office that one of his clones had managed to infiltrate. Of course, that's not even including the fact you were in a genin team under the Yondaime himself, his only team in fact. He left it hanging as Sasuke's head jerked from watching him, to instead focusing on Kakashi with something now approaching respect. Kakashi clapped his hands together appreciatively. Someone has been busy indeed, I see. But enough of Naruto showing off, I think. Let's get on with the test, as I imagine you're all starting to get a little hungry. As if on cue, there were 3 hungry rumbles from the genin present, who all looked at Kakashi somewhat angrily for bringing it up and reminding them of the fact. The man chuckled and placed 3 bentos that he summoned out of a scroll on the rock behind him, and Naruto knew his eyes weren't the only ones that followed the food somewhat hungrily. Kakashi then reached into his top pocket and pulled out a pair of silver bells, which he showed to them happily before placing them on his belt. The purpose of this exercise is simple. To pass this test and become a member of the team, you need to retrieve one of these bells from me before this timer goes off. He paused and pulled a small egg timer from his pocket, setting it to 2 hours and placing it next to the bento boxes. Also, if you don't get a bell, not only won't you be getting lunch, but you will be going back to the academy for another year. The cheeriness with which the man talked about their failure probabilities was annoying Naruto no end, but rather than comment once more, he let Sakura raise her hand as she had obviously been wishing to since the start of the copy Nin's explanation, and the masked man nodded for her to speak. But sensei, there are only 2 bells and 3 of us? The man nodded once more. That is true, Sakura, only 2 of you can get a bell, so the one that doesn't get one will fail automatically. Of course, for any of you to pass, you have to beat me first, and for that, I advise you come at me with the intent to kill. As the man jumped away from them, the only thought that ran through Naruto's head was that he was glad he had told one of his backup clones to bring his axe. Location change, Hokage Tower. The Hokage Tower was fairly empty. The missions had all been handed out and all that were currently present were the Hokage, some of his secretaries and other workers, and of course the Jounin that had been tasked with teams for that year. They were waiting on one last member to arrive, which considering his previous habits during this day was unusual for him. Regardless of his almost reflexive tardiness, genin graduation tests were something that the man always finished with quickly and as such was usually one of the first here, no doubt finishing up as fast as he could to then return to his illicit reading material and whatever else the man chose to do with his time. The Hokage was waiting slightly worriedly, as only yesterday he had received a threat against the village from the same source that had infiltrated it to spy upon Naruto with little to no effort. But the idea that the boy might be the target was noted by Anko. This theory arose as she commented that the woman in question seemed to dislike the village as a whole other than the young container, meaning that if she had gone as far to risk her discovery and capture for the warning, it was most likely to protect the boy. As such, he had assigned shinobi to watch over the boy during the daylight hours, and he would be talking with the boy about changing his lodgings to a more secure location until the threat was apprehended, though he couldn't help but think that the boy was responsible for Kakashi being late. As if waiting for him to think that, the copy Nin appeared in a small puff of chakra, and the Hokage had to bite back a noise of surprise as he took the man's look into account. The man was dusty, covered in mud, and there was a deep shoulder injury that had been obviously self-bandaged some time ago. The man's single visible eye was almost murderous as he fixed it upon the Hokage, grinding out a single sentence. Why? Why did nobody think to tell me that I have a genin that can not only use chakra manipulation to enhance his speed to that of a low chunin from resting stance, coordinate his clones into something that is slowly starting to resemble a cohesive unit? Oh, and let's not forget wields a bloody battle axe that of course his clones get as well. It was at this point that Sarutobi realized that he had never actually got Naruto to make an official report of what had happened yesterday, and the ones from Anko and Himako were currently being analyzed by the intelligence department, so naturally there is no way Kakashi could have found out about the recent developments in one of his team. He was saved from replying by his son, Asuma, who had also been taking a genin team that year, speaking somewhat boisterously to the copy Nin. So what's wrong with the kid having a few unknown skills that weren't in his academy reports? I assume we are referring to the Uzumaki kid here. Kakashi's eye turned to rest its glare upon the younger Sarutobi, as he replied somewhat more somberly. The reason it is important is that if I had known how skilled he was, I wouldn't have underestimated him as much as I did. So when he got me in the shoulder with his cloak and dagger move, I acted reflexively rather than analytically. That brought the somber mood to the rest of the room. Ninja reflexes were not to be underestimated by anyone, especially ones that belonged to such an experienced and scarred individual as Kakashi. Sarutobi tilted his hat back seriously as he gazed at Kakashi. What happened, Kakashi? Where is Naruto and how bad is it? The man sighed as he reiterated what had happened after he arrived at the training ground to observe the waiting kids. Sarutobi frowned at Naruto's excuse of reporting the mission the day before, as that was obviously not true, but considering the lateness that Anko came to report the threat after volunteering to check upon him, he may well have just overslept and preferred not to have said as such, and also it did provide him with a decent excuse to cover his unnaturally healed injuries. Shaking it off for the moment, he turned his attention back to Kakashi as he began his story. Flashback. An hour in, and Kakashi had to say he was surprised by the actions of the 3 he was testing, well, specifically one of them if he was honest. The other 2 had acted fairly similarly to what their academic profiles had suggested, though if the girl's weakness to Genjutsu was similarly disproportionate to the results, he might have to ignore them entirely in her regard. The young container was what surprised him though. rather than rushing headfirst into the unknown situation and trying to engage him in combat. Naruto had followed his teammates into hiding around the clearing, and after that Kakashi had to admit that he had some difficulty in keeping track of the boy as he created shadow clones and spread them around the clearing, before disappearing off into the woods to the south. After a couple more minutes, half of the clones had then attacked on some unknown signal, their taijutsu non-existent but fast and strong for the boy's age, which coupled with the clones' numbers had Kakashi on the back foot for a few moments as he blocked and evaded the flurries of attacks. It quickly changed, however, when decided to be a little serious, the clones reduced to chakra smoke with seemingly nothing to show for it. Sasuke had then tried to take advantage of the distraction, and Kakashi lost track of what the boy's clones were doing temporarily, concentrating on assessing the Uchiha skills, which were very impressive for a graduate and even most genin. They fought for almost 15 minutes, Kakashi doing the minimum to keep ahead of the boy and his attempts to grab a bell from him. Then the boy pulled out what was obviously his best trick, the fireball jutsu that was the jutsu of choice for the Uchiha clan, though Kakashi had easily avoided it before using an earth technique to capture the boy and leave him with only his head above the ground. Once that was done, Kakashi waited for the next attack, presumably from the blonde considering the number of clones that he had at his disposal and ready to use. The attack didn't materialize, however, and once he activated his limited sensing abilities, he noticed that Sakura had been removed from where he had left her, and that there were several Narutos watching him from various points whilst another dozen were gathered further away in the distance, though how far away he couldn't tell. He was after all not at all proficient in the area beyond the basic techniques. Leaping off in the direction that he detected the group of clones, he was surprised when the clones that had been watching him rushed at him, obviously trying to prevent him from reaching his destination. They were quickly dealt with, but they seemed to have served their purpose as the other clones were prepared for his arrival, and several sets of traps activated as he leapt down into the clearing the clones were in. He parried the kunai and shuriken with practiced ease, using his arm guards, several of them badly aimed enough that he only had to move slightly to avoid them rather than block, causing a couple of the clones to look worriedly at one of their number as if awaiting orders from him. Kakashi chuckled. The one they had looked at was obviously the original Naruto, even as the boy in question nodded his head and the clones ran towards him, obscuring his view of the original as they attacked from multiple angles at once. These clones seemed to have learnt from the previous clones' mistakes, however, and were more cautious in their attacks against him. They were still no challenge, but they lasted an extra couple of seconds than the previous clones, and Kakashi was starting to get concerned about the blonde's plan. Seeing as when the chakra smoke cleared he saw the boy stood there, grin plastered on his face as he hefted a battle axe to rest on his shoulder from the hands of a clone that had evidently just landed in the clearing with the weapon. Then Naruto raised his hands and formed the shadow clone hand seal, the clone that had handed him the axe intercepting Kakashi just long enough for the technique to work before being batted away by Kakashi as he rushed to intercept the now slightly dangerous threat presented to him. He ducked under the first axe swing, slightly surprised to find a second axe being swung towards where he had dodged to, causing him to roll under it, dispelling two clones with sharp strikes to the knees as he did so. Rising to his feet, he drew a kunai to deflect the next axe strike, which was aimed at his torso, flicking the blow over his shoulder into the skull of a surprised clone, who also disappeared in a poof of smoke, which gave Kakashi time to finish off two more of the clones and roll away from the rest of the group. The remaining Narutos glanced at each other, then faced off in a rough line, though it was clear that one of them was hanging back ever so slightly even as the others charged forwards towards him. Kakashi felled one with his kunai before it even ran 5 yards towards him, drawing another in time to duck beneath two strikes aimed for his upper body, and he struck forwards with his knife with blinding speed, dispelling both and then withdrawing his arm to deflect another attack. This exchange continued for another 10 seconds until only one Naruto was facing off against him, breathing heavily, an axe ready in front of him. With a yell he charged forwards, swinging his axe with an obvious lack of training, allowing Kakashi to easily trip him over and disarm him in one swift move, tossing the axe to his left side even as Naruto rolled back to his feet. It was only as he saw the grin on Naruto's face and he registered the heaviness of the axe he had just discarded that he realized what had happened. Turning towards where he had thrown the axe, he found himself with Naruto well inside his guard, utilizing a speed that he had not shown at all thus far to achieve such a surprise. As Naruto cut into his shoulder with his weapon, Kakashi's survival instincts kicked in, and all the self-imposed limits that he had put upon his skills came off as his body instinctively acted to defend itself. Even as he slammed his chakra-enhanced fist into Naruto's sternum with a sickening crack and his other hand wrested the axe away from him, Kakashi's mind took control once more in time to see Naruto slam into the ground 20 yards away from him, silent scream on his face as blood began to froth from his mouth in dangerous amounts. Kakashi created 2 shadow clones of his own even as he rushed to the boys' side, and they disappeared without waiting for verbal orders to track down the remaining team members and bring them back to the starting point, even as he grabbed Naruto and took off at a run, not trusting Shushin to not damage the boy any more than he had already accidentally done so. What he did not find out until later was that the girl on the team was sat shivering in horror off to one side of the clearing, looking down at the 2 bells that the clone of her teammate had been holding just before its creator was crippled, causing it to disappear with a crack. Flashback end. Sarutobi was looking at Kakashi with shock, and he wasn't the only one. So one boy, not even a genin, managed to get the drop on you? One of the most paranoid bastards in the village? This comment came from an unexpected source, as Anko walked from where she had been leaning against the door of the room, her face surprisingly serious as she walked forwards into the room. And that is not to mention that you then shattered every rib in his rib cage in at least 2 different places, cracked 2 vertebrae in his spine, and pulverized his stomach and lungs as a reward for his creativity. That caused a large mix of reactions from the group of jounin, several looking shocked at the sheer amount of damage that had been dealt, whilst others looked sad that the boy's career had effectively been finished before he could begin. There were some injuries that even the medicnines would not be able to fix, and spinal injuries were in that category. Kakashi looked ashamed at the accusation of his lost control, whilst Sarutobi looked questioningly at Anko for a moment before asking his question. No offense, Anko-san, but what about this boy means you paid enough attention to be here on his behalf right now? Last I checked you have only met twice. He stopped as Anko pulled out a rather thick file from her jacket and dropped it in front of him. My report on the boy's psyche from my interaction with him. As you can tell by its thickness, he has more issues than most of my current patients, solved and otherwise. With this in mind, not to mention the fact that he is currently the target of at least 1 skilled infiltrator and a possible flight risk due to his treatment, I decided to keep tabs on him, where he went and what he did, etc. So imagine my surprise when walking down the street to get some dango, I nearly get knocked off my feet by Kakashi, who is holding said boy like a broken doll. She threw a glare at the man in question before continuing to talk. So after Kakashi dropped him off at the hospital and disappeared, I decided to stick around as the medics did what they could for his injuries. That was 2 hours ago, by the way, and about half an hour ago Naruto woke up, despite the anesthetic they were pumping into him. He couldn't breathe properly, let alone speak, so when he got frantic enough that he was worsening his injuries, I had to physically restrain him and explain that he was safe and where he was, giving him some paper to write on which was a challenge in and about itself. It became clear through his frantic scribblings that he thinks that you Kakashi are one of those that hates him for what is inside of him, and that today's exercise was just an excuse for you to try and kill him in a way you could get away with it. A number of people flinched at that. For a boy that was mostly ignorant of the less well-known parts of shinobi life, such an attack could certainly be construed that way. The Hokage looked over at Kakashi shrewdly, trying to work out what had made the masked man run off as he did. So Kakashi, if you haven't been at Naruto's side for the last 2 hours, what the hell have you been doing? The masked nin didn't visibly react to his leader's anger, but his reply made it clear exactly why he was still looking at the ground rather ashamedly. Well, the reason for that was that Sakura had seen what I had done to Naruto and reacted rather violently towards my shadow clone's attempts to calm her down. Flashback. Get away from me, you monster! Sakura screamed as she threw another kunai at the clone of the copy nin, who dodged it hastily as he held up his hands in an appeasing manner. Sakura-chan, please. It's not what it looks like. The next kunai flew towards his crotch, causing him to leap in the air to avoid it. Don't you, Sakura-chami, you bastard. I saw you kill Naruto in that clearing. The clone paled under the mask and dodged another projectile, this one a shuriken, and reached for his earpiece so that he could contact the original. Boss, Sakura's gone nuts. It seems she thinks we killed Naruto when we reacted. I need you back here ASAP, as I really not wanting to end up being punctured by kunai. She growled at his statement, and as such he spent the next few minutes dodging the occasional projectile whilst trying to calm the girl down. At last, he felt a familiar presence on the edge of the clearing area and breathed a sigh of relief as the original flickered down behind the girl and knocked her out with 2 simple pressure point attacks. The two looked at each other, and the clone couldn't but drive the point home to the original even as he dispelled. Really not the best day we have had recently, is it? Flashback end. So you've managed to cripple one student that if he were anyone else would be out of the ninja service with his injuries, cause one to have a semi-mental breakdown, and both of them think that you're out for Naruto's life? It's a good job the team failed, otherwise it would be a nightmare. Sarutobi rested back in his seat, content that at least with this debacle Naruto would be permissible to resit the year despite having exceeded the 2 resit limit that was applicable to most candidates, and he would be able to rescind the fine and hours he had applied to Naruto as a form of compensation to the boy. He stopped, however, when Kakashi let out an uneasy chuckle and raised his injured hand, which was closed in a fist. Actually, Hokage-sama, I think we are going to have to settle with the nightmare. And his hand opened, revealing 2 silver bells, which were the key to his test. The strings they were attached to cut very close to the metal itself. Persona, Naruto Uzumaki. Naruto awoke quite sharply, memories of what had knocked him out streaming back to him as he did so. Pain coursed through him as he tried to sit up, and he bit back a cry as his eyes shot open in shock. The room was dark and there was no light through the window, which meant that it was probably nighttime. Looking round the room, he was surprised to find himself in one of the private rooms, which were usually reserved for shinobi who had suffered heavy injuries. Looking down, he found his chest covered in bandages and his legs restrained along with his hands. As he jerked his limbs in an attempt to free himself, an unfamiliar voice called across to him from the shadows. I wouldn't do that if I were you, Naruto-san. It would not be wise for you to move considering your still very serious injuries. He relaxed slightly as a man in a frog mask stepped forwards from where he had obviously been standing guard. He recognized the build and mask from some of the ANBU that had picked him up to see the Hokage about his. Frog-san. He managed to croak out before his raspy throat gave up and he started coughing heavily. Frog was by his side in a moment, hand glowing slightly green as he gently held Naruto down, the pain in his chest and throat disappearing even as he relaxed a bit further. Apologies, Naruto-san, but it would be best if you simply rested until the morning, which will give you a chance to recover somewhat further from your extensive injuries. If it would help you, I can induce your stupor for you. Nodding slightly in assent to the idea, knowing that he would struggle to be able to return to his sleep naturally given the situation. There was a moment's pause as the ANBU ran through 4 hand seals before pressing the fingers of his left hand against Naruto's head. Naruto's vision blackening as he felt sleep overtake him almost immediately. His last thought a wonder of why the doctors that had treated him before had never used this technique on him to deal with him being hyperactive. However, he found himself opening his eyes very shortly afterwards, and wondered for a moment if the ANBU had performed the technique correctly. This thought dispelled itself hurriedly as he looked around. Wherever the hell he was, he certainly wasn't in the hospital ward any longer. He seemed to be in some sort of corridor, though with the minute amount of reddish light that was seemingly only available from one end of the corridor, he couldn't be entirely sure of its exact size or makeup. There also seemed to be a small river flowing down the middle of the corridor, and looking into it he found it murky and unclean, quite unlike the natural rivers that were spread throughout Konoha and its surrounding forests. With no other inkling of where he should be going or how to get out of the corridor, he decided to approach the lighted end of the corridor. The corridor then began to expand into what seemed to be a large intersection, the ceiling of which stretched far beyond where he could see in the dim lighting and the walls interspaced with several other entrances similar to the one he was exiting at that moment. What was more interesting was the large number of pipes that were running along the walls away from a point on the far side of the room that was separated by a cage-like wall that stretched up out of sight, probably to the ceiling itself, a few of the pipes containing a red flowing liquid which seemed to be the source of the light in the room. As he stepped forwards into the middle of the room, his eyes were drawn to part of the cage area. More particularly an area that looked like an openable door that was held closed by a piece of paper that had some kanji scripted upon it. Walking towards it, he managed to decipher the word seal that was written upon it just in time to jump back defensively as something big moved in the shadows of the cage. A sense of apprehension filled him as 2 slitted eyes, each the size of him at least, opened before locking onto him with a predatory look that sent shivers up his sides. A deep voice emanated from everywhere, the pressure on him increasing until he was forced to one knee and breathing hard even as the words washed over him and a 10-story fox stalked out of the shadows, 9 tails swaying lazily. So you are the unlucky mortal that has been made my jailer this time round. Well, my container. Make yourself comfortable as we have many things to talk about,